There is a rhythm to the sea that speaks to something ancient within us. A soft rise and fall like breath, timeless, constant, and unknowably deep. Long before compasses pointed north or sails caught trade winds, human eyes stared at distant horizons, wondering what lay beyond the shifting blue. In those early murmurs of history, the sea was more than a path. It was a mirror, a test, a promise. From carved canoes, gliding over quiet river mouths, to fleets of warships, steering through cannon smoke, the ocean has always asked for something in return: courage, resolve, and vision. And at the helm of every great ship, across every era, stood someone willing to answer. Not just sailors or soldiers, but commanders, steady voices in chaos. Strategists whose choices altered the fate of empires, quiet minds who listened to wind and tide as if they were old friends. Tonight, we begin their story. Across these chapters, we'll drift through centuries and seaways, exploring the lives of the greatest naval commanders in history. Each one a lighthouse in their own time. Each one a name the sea never forgot. So, come, let's explore history together. Your love and support truly mean the world to me. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Grab your coffee and let's get started. The breeze that rolls off the Aegean carries more than salt. It whispers of triremes cutting water like blades, of oars dipped in unison, of sails unfurling under a sun older than stone. Along these rocky shores and azure harbors, the city-state of Athens once stood restless, ambitious, vulnerable, and not yet great. But one man, with eyes fixed on the sea and mind turning faster than a rudder in storm, saw that destiny for his people might be written not on land but upon waves. His name was Themistocles. Not born to noble lineage, nor reared in polished halls, Themistocles was a son of the people, a man who listened more closely to docks than courts. He walked among shipwrights and merchants, soldiers and fishermen. While others debated poetry or lineage, he asked a quieter question: what if Athens became a naval power? At the time, Sparta ruled the land with iron discipline, and Persia loomed vast beyond the east. Athens, clever but exposed, was vulnerable to invasion. Themistocles, ever forward-thinking, saw in the navy not just defense but destiny. To him, the sea was a wall that could move, strike, protect, and most importantly, expand. Around 48 BCE, a windfall changed everything. A rich silver vein was discovered in the mines of Laurium. Many citizens wanted to divide the wealth evenly, perhaps build infrastructure, or ease the burdens of everyday life. But Themistocles proposed something else: build ships, hundreds of them, fast, narrow triremes that could row into the heart of empires. A fleet that could transform Athens from a vulnerable polis into a maritime power. It wasn't an easy argument. He faced criticism, suspicion, even ridicule. But with steady voice and tireless clarity, he won the assembly over. The silver went to shipyards, and the harbors of Piraeus began to echo with the sound of construction wood being shaped, iron hammered, sails stitched under Mediterranean light. Then came the storm. In 480 BCE, the Persian Empire, under Xerxes, unleashed its full might on Greece. A sea of soldiers on land, and a fleet vast enough to shadow the coastline. Athens, under threat of destruction, evacuated its citizens and prepared for war. It was then, in this moment of terror, that Themistocles' vision came alive. At Salamis, he set a trap. Not with walls or warriors, but with water and wits. He lured the massive Persian fleet into the narrow straits, where their numbers meant nothing, and Athenian agility meant everything. Amid the roar of waves and clash of bronze, the triremes struck. One by one, Persia's massive ships faltered, caught between rocks and hulls, unable to maneuver. The sea became their grave. Victory at Salamis was more than a battle won. It was civilization preserved. Themistocles had used the sea, not as a boundary, but as a weapon. And Athens, buoyed by triumph, began its golden age, not from temples or treaties, but from the deep pulse of the tide. Yet even those who reshape history find themselves slowly forgotten by it. In the years that followed, Themistocles grew too powerful, too ambitious. Political tides turned. He was ostracized, banished by the very people he had protected, exiled. He wandered through foreign courts, eventually finding strange refuge in the court of the Persian king he once defeated. It is said he died in silence, far from his city, thinking perhaps of oars and sails and the cries of victory on waters that remembered him well. But time, that quiet archivist, kept his name. Today, when we think of Athens, we think of philosophy, democracy, and marble glory. But beneath those stones lies a harbor, and on that harbor rests the legacy of a man who believed that greatness does not wait on land. It sails forward with courage. Themistocles' gift was not just strategy or foresight, it was transformation. He showed that the sea, vast and uncertain, could be a cradle for a nation's future. His fleet did not merely defend Athens, it launched her into an era that would shape Western civilization. As you rest now, imagine those wooden ships under moonlight, gently rocking against the dock. Hear the creak of rope, the sigh of tide, and the voice of a commander who saw everything before it became real. The sea carries many names, but it never forgets the ones who spoke its language first. And so, we leave Themistocles in quiet exile, his gaze still fixed beyond the horizon, where ideas become fleets and destiny begins with wind. Let the night carry that memory onward, softly, steadily, like a ship at sea. Mediterranean. Palms lined the harbor in gentle rhythm, and the sea lapped against stone like a murmured promise. Beyond the breeze and bustle, a quiet intensity hung in the air. Carthage was watching Rome, and Rome was watching back. Amid the calls of traders and the distant clang of bronze on wood, one figure walked the shipyards, not as a sailor, nor as a politician, but as something harder to define. Hamilcar Barca, a commander forged in bitterness, vision and storm. His feet tread upon dry land, but his ambitions belonged entirely to the sea. Carthage, at its height, was a maritime marvel, nestled in North Africa, yet reaching into Spain, Sicily, and the isles beyond. It breathed through its navy. Its ships were sleek, fast, and numerous. Its admirals, sharp, calculating, often merciless. But against it rose a rival, young, land-rooted, and fiercely determined, the Roman Republic. The First Punic War would mark the beginning of their centuries-long dance, a contest not just of fleets and formations, but of identities. Rome, the land's iron, and Carthage, the sea's silver. Hamilcar entered the war late, but not without purpose. The conflict had raged for years, bleeding both sides, drawing in Sicily like a chessboard no one could claim. Rome, unaccustomed to naval warfare, had begun building fleets by copying captured Carthaginian ships. Carthage, long masters of the sea, underestimated Rome's ability to learn, but Hamilcar was different. He understood that war wasn't just a matter of ships or soldiers, it was rhythm, timing, and silence. He took command in 2047 BCE, not with grand ceremony, but with quiet precision. With Rome pressing inland and blockading Carthage's ports, he launched daring raids along the Sicilian coast, swift, elusive, disruptive. He struck where Rome was blind, vanished before it could strike back. He commanded not just with might, but with mystique. He based his operations on Mount Eryx in northwest Sicily, a jagged and wind-wrapped place that overlooked the sea like a sentinel. From there, his small but agile forces launched surprise attacks, gathered intelligence, and kept the Roman advance at bay. His navy, though outnumbered, moved like a school of fish, never where the enemy expected, always arriving with purpose. To the Romans, he became a shadow. To Carthage, a symbol of resilience. But even legends are bound by the weight of circumstance. After 23 years, the First Punic War ended not with Hamilcar's defeat, but with Carthaginian politics pulling his feet from the deck. Carthage sued for peace, exhausted and fractured. Rome, triumphant but drained, claimed victory. Sicily was lost. Hamilcar returned home in silence. No parades, no laurels, just a taste of salt and the ache of unfinished business. And yet, history had not finished with him. Carthage, now humbled and burdened with war debt, found itself restless. Mercenaries demanded payment, rebellions flared. In this chaos, Hamilcar rose again, not as a mere admiral, but as a savior. He crushed the internal uprisings, restored order, and turned his gaze westward. His thoughts were no longer of Sicily, but of Spain, a land rich in resources, gold, and military potential. There, far from Roman eyes, he began something new. With his sons by his side, Hamilcar laid the foundation for a revival. In Spain, he built a new Carthaginian power, one not bound by treaties or proximity to Rome. He trained his armies, secured alliances, and instilled within his family the idea that Carthage's true destiny still lay ahead. Among those sons was a boy who watched everything, listened to every lesson, and would one day bring terror to Rome's gates. His name was Hannibal. Though Hamilcar would die before his plans reached their peak, drowning while crossing a Spanish river, they say his legacy did not end. It would sail forward in the minds of his children, in the resolve of his soldiers, and in the chill that Rome would feel for decades to come. He was not the victor of his time, but he was its architect. Where Themistocles had used the sea to defend democracy, Hamilcar used it to avenge dignity. His ships were not just vessels of war, but of warning. That defeat is not always final. That shadows cast upon the sea often return with weight. Tonight, we let his story drift, not with triumph, but with quiet momentum. A commander who saw beyond loss, who believed that the tide could turn. Even if not in his lifetime, the sea remembers men like these, not for where they fell, but for how far they sailed before the storm. As you close your eyes, let the sound of Mediterranean waves return. Hear the distant call of a Carthaginian horn, echoing across Spanish cliffs. Picture the face of a man standing at the helm, not broken, but unbending. Hamilcar, the sea's shadow, the father of vengeance, the admiral Rome could never truly outrun. Let the night carry his legacy into silence, where waves never forget. The morning mist curls gently over the southern coast of the Korean peninsula. It rolls across pine-covered hills, settles in jade-colored inlets, and glides softly over the tide-worn decks of ships anchored in stillness. Beneath the gray, quiet water laps against wood calm now, but once a battlefield of memory and flame. Here, in the late 16th century, a man stood at the threshold of invasion and history. Not a conqueror, nor a courtly aristocrat, but a soldier of silence, a man of duty, pain, and enduring clarity. His name was Yi Sun-sin, and the sea for a time listened only to him. He was not born to war, nor trained for glory. Raised in a modest home during the reign of the Joseon dynasty, he grew up learning Confucian discipline and archery in equal measure. His early years were marked not by fame, but by patience. He waited long for military appointment, endured bureaucratic delay, and faced demotion and dishonor more than once. But in his quiet, persistent nature, he cultivated something greater than ambition, unwavering readiness. That readiness would be tested in 1592, when the sea turned red. Japan, under the warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi, launched a brutal campaign to conquer Korea as a route to China. The Joseon Navy was unprepared, its leadership fragmented, many of its ships outdated. Yet amid the confusion and fear, Yi Sun-sin was appointed to command the Southern Fleet, and with that appointment, the tide began to shift. He studied the coastline like a scholar. He learned the moon's pull, the hidden channels, the rocky narrows where a larger force could be trapped and broken. With his small fleet, he began designing new defenses, the most famous being the Geobukseon, or turtle ship, a low-covered vessel, plated with iron spikes. It carried cannons on all sides and repelled enemy boarding attempts. It was agile, protected, and terrifying, the sea's own armored sentinel. But Yi's genius did not rest in invention alone. It rested in knowing when not to fight. While his contemporaries rushed to glory or fled from disaster, Yi waited. He chose his battles like a poet chooses words sparingly, with weight. At Okapo, Sachion, Honsando, his fleet struck with breathtaking precision. Japanese armadas, far larger and seemingly invincible, were routed by Yu's tactics. He used the sea itself, wind, current, geography, as a co-commander. His fleet moved in coordinated arcs, firing from multiple angles, withdrawing before it could be surrounded. His flagship was always in the thick of it, but never beyond control. By 1593, Yi had not lost a single battle. His fleet had destroyed over 100 enemy ships, many without losing even one of his own. Yet power, even earned with brilliance, breeds envy. Court officials, threatened by his rising fame and manipulated by rivals, accused him of insubordination. He was arrested, tortured, and demoted to a common soldier. His armor stripped, his name tarnished. Most would have broken. Yi endured. When the war flared again in 1597, Joseon's fleet, under another admiral, was nearly annihilated. In desperation, the king called Yi back. At this point, only 12 ships remained. 12. No admiral could win a war with 12 ships. But Yi did not need reassurance. He simply said, "I still have 12 ships. That is enough to fight the enemy." It was not a boast. It was a vow. And at the Battle of Myeongyang, in the swirling, treacherous currents of the strait, he made good on that vow, with 12 ships against over 300. Yi positioned his fleet in the narrow channel where the tide shifted violently. Enemy ships, unfamiliar with the waters, collided, stalled, and scattered. Yi's ships struck with accuracy and retreated into the swirl again and again. By the end of the battle, over 30 Japanese ships were destroyed. Yi had lost none. His leadership held not through fear, but through presence. He inspired his sailors not with grand speeches, but by standing where the cannonballs fell. He wrote detailed battle reports, not for self-praise, but for the record of service. And he wept not for honor, but for the lives lost in every clash. In 1598, at the Battle of Noryang, Yi Sun-sin led his final engagement. As his fleet secured victory and repelled the last major Japanese forces from Korean waters, a stray musket ball struck him. He knew at once, but rather than announce his injury, he whispered to those around him, "Do not let the soldiers know I am dead." He died standing. His flag still flew. His fleet, unaware, continued to fight and win. Only after the battle did his officers lower their eyes in silence, realizing they had lost their admiral. But history had gained a legend. Yi Sun-sin remains, to this day, a symbol of discipline, courage, and unshakable purpose. He left behind no conquest, no plundered kingdom, no sprawling empire, only journals, maps, and the soft echo of strategy. His turtle ships would fade into time, but his calm, his clarity, and his reverence for life linger like mist on the morning tide. As you breathe slowly now, picture the stillness of the sea before dawn. Let your thoughts drift gently across moonlit waters, where a quiet admiral once paced the deck, watching, waiting, always ready, and let the waves carry you there, where loss turns into legacy, and duty becomes destiny. The marshes of Wessex lay low and quiet beneath a grey English sky. Wind brushed softly through reeds, and the river Parrett curled through misted earth like a sleeping thread. It was a landscape of silence and stillness until the oars came, until sails appeared against the fog, until the Vikings arrived as they had for years, fierce and many like storms made flesh. And in that fragile silence, a king listened. Alfred was not yet called the Great. He was a weary ruler of a weary land, his kingdom battered, his people scattered, and his future uncertain. In the 9th century, England was not one nation, but a fractured quilt of kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. The Danes, bold and relentless, had overrun most. Only Alfred's Wessex remained, and even that hung by a thread. But Alfred's mind worked not in desperation, but in design. He knew the Vikings were not merely raiders of villages, they were sailors, Their power came not only from axes and swords, but from ships, swift, shallow draft vessels that slid up rivers, struck hard and vanished into the tide. If Alfred was to defend his realm, he needed more than walls and warriors. He needed a fleet. And so, amid war, poverty, and political uncertainty, he began to build one. What emerged in the late 880s was not just a reaction, it was a vision. Alfred designed his ships differently than the Norse longships. They were longer, with higher sides for protection, and powered by both sail and oar. They held more men and in some designs bristled with archers. These were not raiding boats. They were sea fortresses made to defend, intercept, and hold. It was an idea born from observation. Alfred had studied Viking tactics with almost painful attention. He noted where they landed, how they moved, how they relied on surprise and retreat. His goal was not to outbuild the Vikings in number, but to outthink them in design. His first naval engagement came in 1896 CE, when he deployed a fleet to intercept Danish ships near the southern coast. The waters churned as both sides closed in. Alfred's ships, larger and less maneuverable in narrow shallows, struggled at first. But where the Vikings relied on speed, Alfred's men fought with discipline. When one Danish ship grounded on a sandbank, Alfred's sailors boarded and overwhelmed it. Another was driven ashore and broken. The engagement was not a sweeping victory, but it was the beginning of something deeper. For the first time, an English king had used a fleet, not just as transportation but as a weapon. It marked the first stirrings of what would become, centuries later, one of the most formidable navies in history. The English sea-born spirit, which would grow into empire and oceanic reach, began here in muddy marshes under low skies, with ships still new and uncertain. But Alfred's greatness did not rest in ships alone. He understood that the sea, though vital, was only one front. He restructured his land forces, built fortified settlements known as burhs, and introduced legal reforms to unify and protect his people. He invited scholars to his court, promoted the English language, and translated works of philosophy and theology, believing that a kingdom's strength came not only from defense, but from knowledge. And through all of it, he never ceased listening to the sea. To Alfred, water was both a threat and a gift. It brought invaders, yes, but it also brought trade, communication, and connection. His fleet was not built from a lust for conquest, but from a need to protect the fragile peace of a people still finding their place in the world. He died in 1899 CE, just past 50, worn from years of hardship. But his legacy did not drift into the mist. Alfred's ships became a blueprint. His vision, a kingdom protected by water and thought, laid the foundation for the future navy of England. His story was passed on, not in boastful legend, but in quiet reverence. A man who held the line when others fell, a ruler who turned tides, not with might, but with careful, deliberate change. Even centuries later, British naval commanders would look back on him, not as a warrior alone, but as the origin of an ideal that the sea, when respected and studied, could become a nation's greatest ally. Tonight, let your mind return to those misty waters. See the silhouette of a single ship gliding through dawn light. Hear the steady rhythm of oars, the hush of wind through rigging, the soft creak of wood. Picture a king standing alone on the bank, watching not for glory, but for peace. Alfred, the quiet builder, the watcher of waves, the first architect of an island's shield. Let his legacy settle softly now, like fog on the river, for from quiet resolve, great currents flow, and from still waters, history begins to stir. The harbor at Nanjing shimmered beneath early morning haze, its waters painted silver by a slow rising sun. Lanterns still flickered on the quayside as crews stirred aboard vessels, unlike any seen before. Towering above the docked merchant ships were leviathans, vast wooden constructions with 9 masts, echoing with the groan of thick rope and the calls of sailors, readying for voyage. These were treasure ships, Bao Chuan, and at their head stood a man cloaked not in gold or war armor, but in deep silk robes, steady and serene. Jing He, admiral of the Ming dynasty, stood watching the horizon, his hands clasped behind his back, not seeking conquest, but connection. He would command 7 voyages across the known world, not to dominate, but to be seen, and to see. His fleet, unmatched in size and elegance, carried not just goods, but gifts. Not just weapons, but wonder. Born in 1371 in Yunnan, Jing He was not destined for the sea. He was born into a Muslim family of Central Asian descent, and as a child he was taken into imperial service during the Ming conquest. Castrated and placed in the palace bureaucracy, he could have disappeared into history, one of many. But fate chose differently. His keen mind, loyalty, and charisma drew the attention of the emperor himself. In time he rose through the ranks, and when the young emperor conceived a new vision for China, one of presence, diplomacy, and awe, Jing He became the hand that would reach across the oceans. By 1405, the fleet was ready. Over 300 ships, some over 400 feet long. So massive that their dimensions would not be matched again for centuries. The fleet carried thousands of men, sailors, interpreters, soldiers, doctors, navigators, and envoys. It was not a military armada, though it was capable of defense. It was a declaration that China had emerged from the chaos of dynastic change, and now wished to present itself with dignity and generosity to the world. The voyages began gently, sweeping down the South China Sea to Champa and Java, then to the Malay Peninsula. But quickly they grew more ambitious, to India, Sri Lanka, and across the Indian Ocean to Arabia and East Africa. Jing He stepped onto shores few Chinese had seen and met rulers who marveled at the grandeur of his ships and the silks and porcelains they carried. He brought gifts, accepted tributes, and returned with treasures, spices, exotic animals, rare gems, and stories. A giraffe was brought back from East Africa, so strange to Chinese eyes that it was believed to be a qilin, a mythical creature of peace. The court rejoiced, interpreting its arrival as a sign of harmony between heaven and earth. But Jing He was not just a messenger of peace. On occasion when diplomacy was scorned or piracy threatened trade, he acted with authority. In Sumatra, he quelled rebellion. In Sri Lanka, he clashed with a hostile ruler. But each response was measured. His mission was never one of conquest. It was one of prestige. He reminded the world that the Middle Kingdom stood strong and benevolent, watching the seas from afar. Yet, beneath the grandeur, time ticked onward. At home, new advisors questioned the ghost. The court began to shift inward again, weary of foreign entanglements, troubled by the rising cost of the voyages. Some saw the oceans as empty extravagance. Others, bound by Confucian conservatism, questioned the value of diplomacy by ship. Gradually, the tides turned. Jing He's final voyage departed in 1431. He was older now, wearied by years of salt and distance. The fleet reached Mecca, perhaps even the far edges of East Africa once more. But on the journey home, the sea, which had carried him so faithfully, became his resting place. He died, it is believed, somewhere near Calicut, perhaps buried at sea, perhaps in a tomb later built in Nanjing. No one knows for certain. What remains, however, is the breath of his journey. Maps, etched with impossible precision, logs detailing stars, currents, and cultures, ceremonial swords gifted by distant sultans, murals painted in flowing silk, legends whispered in port cities far from China's coast, of the giant ships, the calm admiral, and the empire that sailed not to conquer, but to connect. Jing He's voyages faded from policy, but not from memory. China would later close its maritime doors, and the treasure ships would be dismantled, their wood repurposed, their blueprints lost. The world moved on, but something had shifted. For Jing He showed what sea power could be, that a fleet could carry dignity, diplomacy, and curiosity, that the oceans were not borders to defend, but bridges to cross. His voyages mark a quiet, luminous moment in history, where exploration was driven, not by hunger for land, but by the gentle confidence of presence. Tonight, let your thoughts drift with the sails of those vast ships. Feel the warm breeze of the Indian Ocean, the hush of canvas catching wind, and the faint scent of sandalwood and clove rising from the hold. Picture Zheng He standing beneath stars, eyes toward Mecca, heart always turning back toward home. No admiral before or after him would command so many ships, touch so many shores, or do so with such grace. Let your breath slow, like tide upon calm harbor, and let the night carry you beyond the map, where silk meets salt and peace rides the waves. Along the Ligurian coast, where steep hills descend into sea, the port of Genoa glimmers like an ancient jewel set in stone. Its harbors, long shaped by wind and trade, hold memories of sails and voices, of merchants and warriors, of ships that once sailed the known world in search of gold, grain, and glory. And at the heart of this maritime republic's proudest chapter stood a man whose name echoed far beyond his narrow homeland, Andrea Doria. He was not born into royalty, yet he was every inch a prince of the sea, dignified, fierce in resolve, and endlessly loyal to his city. His life stretched across the 15th and 16th centuries, a time when Europe was not yet carved into fixed nations, but rather composed of rising powers, fragile alliances, and an ever-changing tide of ambition. Andrea Doria was born in 1466 into the ancient Doria family, noble but modest in means. Orphaned young, he was raised under the weight of lineage and the light of possibility. Early on, he entered the service of others, first as a soldier on land, then as a sailor upon the open Mediterranean. He studied warfare, diplomacy, and the anatomy of ships. In time, he did not merely serve fleets, he built them, led them, transformed them. As the Italian city-states vied for survival amidst the ambitions of France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, the Mediterranean became more than just a corridor of trade. It became a chessboard. Venice, Rome, Naples, and Genoa each sought to control the flow of goods and alliances. Pirates roamed, empires threatened, chaos stirred. In this sea of rivalry, Doria rose not only as an admiral but as a statesman. His early career saw him in service to France, leading Genoese ships under the French crown. He battled Barbary corsairs and Ottoman forces with precision, pushing back threats from North Africa to the Eastern Isles. But Doria was never a servant of one master. He was a guardian of Genoa, and when France's designs conflicted with his homeland's independence, he shifted allegiances, not for personal gain but for national survival. In 1528 he returned to Genoa under new banners, this time allied with Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. With Spanish support, Doria led a revolution to free Genoa from French control. His fleet blockaded the port. The city fell without ruin. No sack, no fire, only transition. And then, with rare restraint, Doria refused the offer to become a ruler. Instead, he restructured the Republic's government, stepped back from direct control, and continued to lead the navy. Few men in power would choose dignity over dominion, but Doria did. His navy, under imperial authority, became a formidable force against the Ottoman Empire, which had begun its westward surge. At Preveza in 1538, he commanded the Holy League's forces in a bitter naval engagement with the famed Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa. Though the battle ended in frustration, Doria, cautious and unwilling to risk destruction, withdrew. His reputation remained intact. He knew when to fight and when to preserve. Throughout his later years, Andrea Doria continued to sail. Even in his 80s, he commanded ships, inspecting hulls, directing formations, walking the length of decks with the eyes of a man who could still see storms before they formed. His sailors respected him, his enemies watched him, his city trusted him. He died in 1560, at the age of 94, a remarkable span in an age of short lives and long wars. His funeral was held not with pomp, but with solemn gratitude. Genoa wept not for a monarch, but for a guardian. Today, monuments stand in his name. Streets and ships bear it still. But his true legacy lies not in bronze, but in the balance he preserved between duty and ambition, between service and sovereignty. Andrea Doria was not flawless. He made mistakes, held biases of his time, and bore the weight of hard decisions. But within him lived a code that placed country above crown and honor above victory. He lived in an age of transformation, when the old feudal world gave way to the modern state, and the sea became not just a frontier, but a stage. Through it all, Doria stood steady, like the coastline of Genoa itself, battered yet unbending. As you drift into quiet now, let your mind return to that harbor. Imagine the gentle clink of anchor chains, the echo of footsteps on a dock, the rustle of silk banners fluttering in the breeze. Picture a tall, gray-haired figure walking toward a ship, his eyes on the tide, his thoughts with his people. Andrea Doria, Admiral of Genoa, sailor of balance, statesman of restraint, a noble soul in an age of noise. Let his memory flow gently tonight, like salt wind through rigging. For some leaders do not rise by force, but by the calmness with which they carry the storm. The cliffs of Devon rise in muted browns and greens above the Atlantic, worn soft by centuries of wind and water. Below, the waves gather in long, slanted lines, pressing again and again against England's shores like distant questions, searching for an answer. From such a coast came one of the most storied figures in maritime history, a man who would sail the globe, rewrite expectations, and leave behind a wake not easily forgotten. Sir Francis Drake, privateer, navigator, explorer, and to some, a pirate. To others, a hero. He was born around 1540, in the county of Devon. The son of a farmer preacher, raised modestly near the sea, his early life was touched by religious upheaval and the specter of Spanish power. Then dominant on the high seas, England was small, uncertain, and learning its place in a world rapidly being redrawn by oceanic empires. Drake learned early that the sea was more than salt and wind. It was opportunity. As a young man, he joined trading voyages, many of them unofficial, some bordering on outlawed. In the Caribbean, he watched Spain's colonial machinery with growing fascination and resentment. He saw the treasure fleets, the galleons thick with gold and silver, and the systems of extraction built upon native suffering. He began to understand not just navigation, but disruption. By his 30s, he had become a skilled seaman and a daring privateer, sanctioned by the English crown to raid Spanish holdings. In 1572, he captured the Spanish port of Nombre de Dios in present-day Panama and seized a hoard of silver bound for Europe. He crossed the Isthmus of Panama on foot, climbed a tree, and for the first time in his life, saw the Pacific Ocean. It said he stood in silence for a long time. Then he whispered that he hoped one day to sail it, not as a passenger, but as a commander. That dream would become history. In 1577, under the secret approval of Queen Elizabeth I, Drake set out with 5 ships on a mission cloaked in exploration and ambition, his goal to pass through the treacherous Strait of Magellan, raid Spanish settlements along the Pacific, and perhaps, just perhaps, complete the second circumnavigation of the Earth. The journey would test everything. Storms battered his fleet along South America's southern edge. The cold sharpened like glass, and men whispered in the dark of mutiny and madness. Of the 5 ships, only one, the Golden Hind, survived the passage into the Pacific. Drake, now alone, began his sweeping arc up the continent's coast, attacking ports and capturing treasure galleons as he went. But beyond the conflict and plunder, something deeper began to unfold. He sailed north farther than most Europeans had dared, seeking a rumored passage east. He wintered in what is now California, claiming the land for England under the name Nova Albion. There, his crew repaired the Golden Hind, shared meals with indigenous people, and mapped stars not seen from home. From there he crossed the Pacific, a stretch of open sea so vast and empty, it silenced even the bold. For months, no land, only blue upon blue, and the long breath of the planet. He reached the Moluccas, navigated through Java, and rounded the Cape of Good Hope. In 1580, 3 years after he began, Drake returned to England, his ship weighted with spice and gold, his name now whispered with awe. He had circumnavigated the world, the first Englishman to do so. For this, The Queen knighted him aboard the very deck of the Golden Hind, anchored at Deptford. The moment was both symbolic and strategic, a signal to Spain and to the world that England was no longer a small island at the edge of things. It was becoming something else, a naval nation, reaching outward. Drake's story, however, did not end in ceremony. He continued to serve as an admiral, most famously during the threat of the Spanish Armada in 15. As Vice Admiral of the English fleet, he played a key role in defeating the vast Spanish invasion force, using fireships and swift attacks to scatter the Armada and force its retreat. But he was more than just a sailor of battles. Drake was a man of contradiction. He was courageous, but at times merciless. He was devout, yet capable of cold ambition. To the English, he was a national treasure. To the Spanish, El Drake, the dragon, a symbol of terror. He lived in a time when maritime law was fluid, when borders were suggestions, and maps were promises waiting to be broken. In 1596, he died at sea off the coast of Panama. During another expedition, not in glory but in illness. He was buried in full armor, at sea beneath the waves that had carried him around the world. His grave has never been found, but his legacy sails still. Drake changed the way the sea was seen. He turned the unknown into the achievable, the distant into the mapped. He proved that the sea was not merely a barrier, but a bridge, a vast circle connecting every shore. As you settle into stillness, picture his ship alone on the Pacific, the moon a pale lantern above, the horizon endless and soft. Hear the timbers creak, the sails sigh, the ocean whisper names in languages no longer spoken. Sir Francis Drake, who sailed the world and gave it a new shape, not as a conqueror, nor a scholar, but as a voyager, one who followed the curve of the sea, until it brought him home again. Let that circle hold you now, gentle, unbroken, infinite. Dawn broke soft over the Atlantic, its light hesitant, like a whisper brushing over the decks of ships that floated motionless off the coast of southern Spain. Dozens of masts pierced the sky, swaying gently in the calm before something vast and irreversible. The sea, so often in motion, held its breath. And at the heart of this great silence, aboard the HMS Victory, stood a man smaller than most, worn by pain, missing an eye and an arm, yet possessed of a presence no storm could bend. Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, the man who gave everything to the sea, and who, on this final morning, would give the last thing he had left, his life. But to understand Trafalgar, and the man who met it with open arms, we must return to earlier tides. Nelson was born in 1758, in Norfolk, England, far from any port, the son of a clergyman, frail in body but bold in heart. He joined the Royal Navy at the age of 12. He served in the West Indies and the Arctic, climbed the ranks not through fortune, but through relentless commitment. Time and again he proved himself in battle, not just as a fighter, but as a thinker. By the late 18th century, the world was at sea in more ways than one. Empires jostled, revolutions sparked, and alliances shifted like wind. Britain, an island nation, saw the Navy as its lungs, the only way it could breathe against growing continental pressure. Nelson rose through this age of uncertainty, like a flame in dusk. In 1797, at Cape St. Vincent, he defied orders to pursue the Spanish fleet and won. In 1798, at the Battle of the Nile, he caught the French Navy off guard in Egypt, destroying it almost entirely and trapping Napoleon's forces inland. His tactics were bold, often unconventional, but always precise. He trusted instinct where others feared protocol. But the sea exacts its toll. At Calvi, in Corsica, Nelson lost the sight in his right eye. Later, in Tenerife, he was shot in the right arm. It had to be amputated. Yet he returned to sea, again and again. His injuries did not dim his spirit, they seemed to sharpen it. By 1805, Britain faced its greatest threat yet. Napoleon, master of Europe, sought to crush British resistance. He planned an invasion, but to do so he needed naval dominance. The French and Spanish fleets combined forces, forming a vast armada. Nelson was given command of the British fleet and dispatched to intercept. The place where they would meet was off Cape Trafalgar, near Cadiz, October 21st. The sea, quiet. The air holding a charge. Nelson knew the enemy had more ships. He also knew they had more fear. On the morning of the battle, Nelson penned a message to his officers, simple, unadorned. England expects that every man will do his duty. But he did not mean duty in the abstract. For Nelson, duty was not obedience, it was clarity. The clarity to act when action was needed, to sacrifice without hesitation, to move forward when fear said stay. He formed his fleet, not in a long line, as was traditional, but in 2 perpendicular columns. This would expose his ships to enemy fire, but it would also slice through the opposing line, breaking their cohesion and forcing a close, decisive confrontation. It was a bold maneuver. Some said reckless, but Nelson trusted his captains, and more importantly, they trusted him. The battle began slowly. 2 great bodies drifting closer. Cannon smoke curled into the sky, then thunder. The Victory led the charge, drawing fire from all sides. Nelson stood upon the quarterdeck, in full uniform, medals glinting. He refused to hide. To him, leadership was visibility. Hours passed in fire and fury. Ships collided. Decks burned. The ocean turned red, and then a single shot. A French sniper, high in the rigging of the Redoutable, spotted the admiral. He took aim. The bullet pierced Nelson's left shoulder, traveled downward, and lodged near his spine. He fell, quietly. Carried below deck, he clung to life, listening to the sounds of battle above, the creak of timber, the roar of cannon, the cries of men. Word reached him that the enemy was breaking, that the British fleet was winning. He smiled, softly. "Now I am satisfied," he said. "Thank God, I have done my duty." Those were his final words. The battle ended with a British victory, so complete that it changed the course of history. The Franco-Spanish fleet was shattered. Napoleon would abandon his dreams of invading England. The sea once again belonged to Britain. But Nelson was gone. He was brought home in a cask of brandy, preserved for state burial. In London, thousands lined the streets in mourning. At St. Paul's Cathedral, he was laid to rest, not just as a hero, but as a symbol of sacrifice, of courage, of the highest form of service. To this day, his statue stands high above Trafalgar Square, not as a monument to war, but to devotion, to the idea that one soul, steady in its course, can turn the tide of nations. As you breathe gently now, let your thoughts drift to that morning sea. See the sails bloom in the wind. Hear the muffled echo of cannon, long past, and picture a man walking calmly across a deck, eyes forward, heart still. Horatio Nelson, the flame who gave everything to keep the light alive. Let his memory guide you through the night, steady as a compass star, silent as a falling sail. The waters around the Tsushima Strait often lie still before dawn, a hush that feels older than time. The sky above them, on the morning of May 27, 1905, was pale and calm, painted with the soft blush of a rising sun. Beneath that light, on the bridge of a ship called Mikasa, stood a man dressed in a modest naval coat, his eyes narrow but steady. He held no grandeur in his posture, no dramatic motion in his hands, only quiet resolve. Chugo Heihachiro, Admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The man who would end centuries of Western naval dominance with one silent decision. But to reach that moment, to understand the weight of Tsushima, we must return to the beginning. Togo was born in 1848 in Kagoshima, on the southern tip of Kakushu, into a samurai family. It was a time of transition. Japan, long isolated, was opening its doors under the pressure of Western powers. The shogunate was weakening. New ideas, new machines, new languages, new ships were seeping in. As a young man, Togo was chosen to study abroad. He traveled to England, enrolling at the Royal Naval College in Portsmouth. There he learned seamanship, engineering and strategy, but he also observed something deeper, the roots of Western naval power and the quiet systems that upheld it. He watched how fleets moved, how leaders decided, how empires held the sea not through passion but through patience. When he returned to Japan, the nation had transformed. The Meiji Restoration had abolished the old samurai class and replaced it with a modern military and industrial state. Togo joined this new navy, rising through the ranks not through politics but through consistency. He fought in the Sino-Japanese War, commanded ships during small skirmishes, and never asked for attention. He simply watched and waited. By 1904, the world's eyes turned to Asia once again. Japan and Russia, two empires of rising ambition, clashed over influence in Korea and Manchuria. The war began on land, but the sea, as always, held the final word. Russia's Pacific Fleet, surprised and outmatched, was largely neutralized early. In response, the Russian Empire dispatched its Baltic Fleet, over 30 warships, on a months-long journey around the world to reinforce its position in East Asia. The voyage was grueling. Ships suffered breakdowns, morale fell, and the fleet limped toward Japan under the weight of exhaustion. Togo knew this. He followed their movements like a fisherman reading the tide. He gathered intelligence, plotted likely routes, and prepared his forces. He did not rush to strike. He did not chase rumors. He let the weight of certainty build. And then, in the last days of May 1905, the Russian fleet entered the Tsushima Strait, the narrow channel between Japan and Korea. Togo's fleet waited just north of them. The sea was quiet, the sky clear. At 2:05 p.m. on May 27th, the Mikasa turned to port, cutting sharply across the Russian line of approach. It was an audacious maneuver, exposing his lead ships to fire, but positioning them for a devastating cross. Togo's famous signal rose above the mast. The fate of the empire rests on the outcome of this battle. Let every man do his utmost duty. It echoed, not as a call for glory, but as a simple truth. There would be no second chance. The battle that followed was swift and brutal. Japanese gunners, trained rigorously and supplied with superior ammunition, struck with eerie precision. Russian ships faltered, fires raged, smoke obscured the horizon. By nightfall, the sea was littered with iron, wood, and silence. Nearly the entire Russian fleet was destroyed, captured, or scuttled. It was the greatest naval defeat of a European power by an Asian force in modern history. But Togo did not celebrate. There were no grand speeches, no songs of conquest. He stood quietly on the bridge, watching the sea swallow the last flashes of fire. His hands rested behind his back. His eyes turned homeward. For him, victory was not pride. It was responsibility. Togo's triumph at Tsushima did more than shift the course of a war. It rewrote global perception. The world saw, perhaps for the first time, that naval power was no longer the exclusive province of the West. That discipline, planning, and patience could shape history as sharply as steel. His legacy grew not in battlefields, but in balance. Togo never ruled. He did not seek political office or personal wealth. He remained an admiral, serving quietly, guiding Japan's future officers with the same calm that had carried him across that fateful sea. When he died in 1934, the nation mourned. Naval officers from across the world, Britain, the United States, France, sent delegations to honor him. Churchill once called him one of the greatest naval commanders who ever lived. But perhaps Togo himself would have asked us to remember, not the battle, nor the medals, but the moment just before, when silence rested over the water, and a decision changed everything. So as you drift now toward stillness, picture the Strait of Tsushima beneath pale skies. See the Mikasa gliding through mist. Hear the faint rhythm of waves against the hull. And on the deck, a figure stands unmoving, not out of fear, but readiness. Not seeking fame, but peace. Togo Haihachiro, the admiral who listened before he spoke, who waited before he struck. and who proved that clarity is might. Let the quiet of that sea carry you softly tonight, where duty meets stillness, and victory begins with calm. There are waters in the Yellow Sea that still whisper his name, where tides shift gently around low islands, and seagulls drift quietly across a sky that remembers everything. It was here, along the jagged coastlines of the Korean peninsula, that one man stood against overwhelming odds, time and time again, with ships he built himself and faith that never bent. Admiral Yi Sun-sin, the unbroken blade of Joseon, the man who never lost a battle. He was born in 1545. In the capital city of Hanyang, now known as Seoul. Yi was raised in a Confucian world where loyalty, humility, and duty were not lofty ideals but daily practices. He studied literature and swordsmanship with equal care, but what set him apart was not simply intellect or strength, it was integrity, a deep, steady sense of rightness, like the tide itself. In a rigid system that favored noble lineage and cautious obedience, Yi's rise was not quick. He passed his military exams later than most, served quietly in border regions, and built his career not with noise but with quiet mastery. He knew how to train troops, he knew how to listen to wind and read the shape of a coastline. And more than anything, he understood preparation, the kind that waits patiently, shaping steel while others rush to fight. That patience would be tested as the 16th century drew to a close. In 1592, Toyotomi Hideyoshi of Japan launched a massive invasion of Korea, aiming to use it as a corridor into China. Tens of thousands of soldiers landed quickly and overwhelmed the peninsula's defenses. Cities fell, panic spread. The land war was chaotic, but at sea Yi stood ready. Stationed in the southern port of Yosu, Admiral Yi had not waited for orders. He had studied the enemy, built local intelligence networks, trained his crews, improved supply chains, and most famously, he had revived an ancient design, the Geobuxion, or turtle ship. Covered in protective metal plating and armed with cannons on all sides, these ships were compact and powerful. Their dragon-like heads spewed smoke to obscure vision. They were unlike anything the Japanese Navy had ever faced. Swift, shielded, and designed for close, decisive battle. His first engagement came at Okapo, where his fleet of just 24 ships routed the Japanese, sinking dozens of their vessels without losing a single one. It was a stunning beginning. And it was only the beginning. Over the next 6 years, Yi would lead Korea through some of the most masterful naval campaigns in history. He used the narrow, island-filled southern coast to his advantage. He fought, not with brute force, but with geometry, positioning his ships where the enemy's formation would collapse, where waves favored his turns, where wind and current became his allies. His tactics blended mathematics and intuition, action and restraint, and he won. Every time, even when vastly outnumbered, even when betrayed. For in 1597, political jealousy turned deadly. Court rivals accused him falsely, and despite his unbroken record, Yi was arrested, tortured, and demoted to foot soldier. He bore it all in silence. He did not protest. He did not plead. He returned to service as a commoner, standing guard with no sword, no ship, and no command. But Korea faltered without him. After his replacement suffered a disastrous defeat at Chilchaliang, losing most of the navy in a single night, the court had no choice. Yi was reinstated. What remained under his command was just 12 ships. The Japanese navy approached with over 300, 12 against hundreds. It should have been a final stand. Instead, it was a masterstroke. He had turned the impossible into history. Yet, he remained unchanged. After each victory, he bowed. He gave credit to his sailors. He wrote not of glory, but of sorrow, for the lives lost, the burden carried, the peace that still hovered beyond reach. And that peace would not come easily. In 1598, the war neared its end. Yi, now in his early 50s, led a joint Korean-Chinese fleet in pursuit of retreating Japanese forces near Noryang. During the final clash, As enemy ships burned and fell back into the mist, Yi was struck by a single bullet. Only afterward did his men learn the truth. He was buried with honor, his legacy written not by poets but by sailors and citizens. Even now, Korean students learn his name from childhood. Naval officers study his tactics. Statues of Yi rise above harbors, not in triumph, but in stillness. His gaze always turned seaward. Yi Sun-sin never lost a battle, not once, because he understood that true command is not about power, but about presence, about seeing clearly in storm and silence alike. As the night deepens, let yourself drift to those straits and inlets where lanterns once swung from wooden beams and the wind carried salt and wood smoke. See a single ship gliding through darkness, its hull low, its cannon silent, guided not by numbers but by vision. Admiral Yi, the man who held the sea through storms and fire. Let his calm guide you now, for in every tide there is one who knows how to listen, and in every night there is one who sails without fear. The waters of the North Atlantic have never belonged to any flag. They roll and crash as they have always done, deep, indifferent, eternal, but within their shifting silence they remember. They carry stories not just of empires and battles, but of those few who sailed for something harder to define. Not land nor crown, but an idea. Among these restless waves, one name still stirs with unusual force. John Paul Jones, the man who would not surrender. The sailor who gave birth to a navy before a nation had found its footing. He was born in 1747, in the fishing village of Kirkcudbrightshire, on the rocky coast of Scotland. His name was simply John Paul then. The sea was his school, and his future from cabin boy to merchant captain by his early 20s. He was quick to learn and quicker to act, but his life at sea would take unexpected turns. By his late 20s, Paul found himself drawn to the American colonies. Their talk of liberty and rebellion, their hunger to define themselves, it echoed something within him. After a quarrel in the Caribbean turned deadly, he fled to America, adding Jones to his name. But he wasn't hiding, he was waiting. And when revolution came, he stepped forward, not as a politician or soldier, but as a sailor. In 1775, the American colonies had no real navy. British ships ruled the Atlantic, but Jones saw an opening. He offered his service to the Continental Congress, and they gave him a small sloop, Providence. With it, he began to craft something new. Not just a navy, but a way of thinking about sea power in the name of a cause. He believed that war at sea should not be mere raiding, nor piracy. It should carry honor, discipline, and strategy. His early missions were daring, patrolling the coast, intercepting British ships, striking where no one expected. But it was in the deeper waters of the Atlantic and the distant coasts of Europe that Jones would leave his true mark. In 1778, aboard the Ranger, he crossed the ocean, taking the war directly to British shores. He raided ports in Ireland and Scotland, sending tremors through the very homeland he had once called his own. At Whitehaven, he led a small force ashore, spiking cannons and setting fires before retreating silently into the sea. It wasn't destruction he sought, it was visibility, a message. America was no longer a distant colony. It had teeth and sails. The British press called him a pirate, a traitor, a ghost, but others saw him as a symbol of persistence, of courage, of something rough and newly born. Yet his most legendary moment came in 1779. Aboard a captured French merchant ship, now renamed Bonhomme Richard, patched together, barely fit for battle, the vessel faced a powerful British warship, the Serapis off Flamborough Head. The moon was high, the air cold. The battle raged into the night. The ships locked hull to hull, their sails burning, decks splintered. At one point, with his vessel sinking and burning beneath him, Jones was asked if he would surrender. His answer has echoed through centuries. I have not yet begun to fight. With grappling hooks, close combat, and sheer refusal to yield, Jones turned the tide. The Serapis struck its colors, The Bonhomme Richard would sink, but Jones transferred to the captured vessel and sailed it to safety. It wasn't just a victory. It was transformation. For the first time, a U.S. naval officer had defeated a British warship in British waters. The world watched, and the sea, as always, remembered. After the war, Jones wandered. He struggled to find a place in the young American Republic, which often celebrated him more in stories than in substance. He served briefly in Russia under Catherine the Great, advised on naval reform, and drifted through courts and coastlines with the weary grace of a man who had seen too much to rest easily. He died alone in Paris in 1792, far from the country he had helped create. His body was buried in a forgotten grave. And yet, more than a century later, the sea called him home. In 1905, American sailors exhumed his remains, escorted by a full naval procession, and laid him to rest at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. There, in a marble crypt beneath the chapel dome, he sleeps, no longer nameless, no longer exiled. John Paul Jones never commanded great fleets. He held no high political rank, but he carried something rarer, the soul of a navy before it had ships. He believed in readiness, in dignity, in fighting not for hatred, but for principle, and in never surrendering the idea of freedom, even when the deck burns and the sails are torn. So as you settle into stillness, let your thoughts wander to those far Atlantic waters, windswept and endless. See the flames licking at canvas. Hear the crack of wood and the cry of orders rising above chaos, and picture one man standing at the heart of it all, resolute, alive with fire, not yet spent. John Paul Jones, who taught the sea that even silence can carry meaning, who sailed not for glory, but for something deeper. Let his spirit steady your night, for on every long voyage, there is one who reminds us, the sea has no country, only courage. Over the wide Pacific, where the sky stretches in quiet gradients, and the sea rolls in long, slow swells, there is a stillness that hides memory. Beneath those waters lie the echoes of a turning point, not loud, not theatrical, but decisive, and standing at the quiet heart of that moment was a man whose voice was rarely raised, whose hand was rarely shaken, and whose mind remained steady while the world trembled. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, the quiet architect of Midway, the man who listened longer than most and struck only when the silence gave permission. Born in 1886, in Baltimore, Maryland, Spruance grew up with a measured temperament. He did not crave attention. He did not chase accolades. At the Naval Academy, he was not the loudest nor the most admired, but he was diligent, thoughtful, and exact. These traits would carry him not just across decades of service, but into the very center of one of history's most fragile crossroads. By 1942, the United States had just begun to find its feet in the Second World War. The attack on Pearl Harbor had scarred the Pacific Fleet, but it had also awakened a resolve. Ships were being repaired, strategies redrawn. The Pacific, vast and volatile, had become a stage where outcomes would echo for generations. Japan, emboldened by early victories, planned an ambitious strike, an assault on Midway Atoll, a tiny strip of coral that offered immense strategic advantage. The Japanese aimed to lure American carriers into a trap and destroy them, securing total naval dominance in the Pacific. But American codebreakers, working quietly and urgently, deciphered the plan. The stage was set. 3 U.S. carriers, 4 Japanese carriers, and thousands of miles of open ocean. Spruance, a rear admiral at the time, was not originally meant to lead the carrier task force. That role belonged to Admiral William Bull Halsey, brash, beloved, and aggressive. But Halsey had fallen ill with a severe skin infection. He personally recommended Spruance as his replacement, a choice that raised eyebrows. Spruance had experience with cruisers, not carriers. He was methodical, not dramatic. But perhaps that was precisely what was needed. As the battle neared, Spruance made decisions not based on instinct or bravado, but on clarity. He listened carefully to his advisors. He studied every intelligence report. He asked questions no one else dared ask, simple ones, quiet ones, that cut to the heart of risk. When the moment came to strike early, uncertain and without confirmation of the full Japanese fleet, he gave the order. His planes launched from the Enterprise and Hornet, flying over hundreds of miles of open sea. Many squadrons missed their marks. Some were shot down in full, and yet, through the layered chaos of conflicting reports and broken radio signals, one squadron of dive bombers found the Japanese carriers unguarded. Within minutes, 3 of the enemy's 4 carriers were aflame, their decks reduced to fire and ruin. The 4th would follow soon after. Midway was not just a victory, it was a redirection. The tide, long rising in favor of Japan, began to turn. Sprouse did not celebrate loudly. He simply watched, calculated, and ensured the remainder of the fleet returned home. His restraint was as important as his timing. He did not pursue the fleeing Japanese recklessly. He conserved his forces, thinking not just of the battle but of the war to come. He was praised, but rarely quoted. He received medals, but never speeches. He would go on to command during the Mariana and Philippine campaigns, co-leading the Fifth Fleet alongside Admiral Chester Nimitz. Again and again, he demonstrated the same composed brilliance, understanding that in naval warfare, the mind must remain still even as the ocean does not. Sprouse believed in logic over ego, in thought over impulse, and when offered the chance to write a memoir, as many of his peers did, he declined. The ships and the sailors, he said, deserve the story more than I do. He retired quietly in 1948, served briefly as ambassador to the Philippines, and passed away in 1969. He was buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery, in a simple grave beside his wife. No grand monument, no towering memorial, and yet his legacy remains. At Midway, a man with no experience in carrier warfare changed the course of the largest ocean war the world has ever known. He did it not through force, but through balance, not with a loud voice, but with an unshaken mind. His name is spoken with respect in quiet circles, where precision is valued more than power, and where patience is seen not as hesitation but as strength. As you breathe now in the hush of evening, imagine the great, open Pacific. No land in sight, only sky and sea, and in the center of it, a single carrier gliding forward. On the bridge, a man watches the horizon, hands folded, eyes clear. He does not speak unless there is reason. He does not strike unless the moment is exact. But when he does, the ocean listens. Raymond Sprouse, the admiral who taught the world that calm is not the absence of strength, but its most enduring form. Let his stillness carry you now, like waves beneath a ship, unseen but steady. For in the noise of history, some voices change everything simply by refusing to shout. There are nights along the coast of Kamakura, when the sea breathes slowly, like a sleeper recalling a distant dream. The waves reach gently across the sand, then retreat, whispering as they go. It is on this same stretch of shore, more than 7 centuries ago, that a storm arrived, not from the sky but from across the ocean. A force so immense it could have rewritten the history of a nation. And yet, when it reached these shores, it was met by something older than empire and deeper than courage. It was met by Hoyo Tokimune, the regent who refused to kneel, the quiet strategist who summoned a nation's will. Tokimune was born in 1251 into the powerful Hojo clan that ruled Japan through the Kamakura shogunate. He was not an emperor, nor a warrior general in the traditional sense. He was a regent, shiking, the voice behind the curtain, the hand that guided the sword, and though his name would later be remembered with reverence, it began in shadow, shaped by responsibility far greater than most ever know. By his 20s, Tokimune had already assumed political command during a time of delicate balance. Japan was a land of samurai and ritual, of discipline and in deep ancestral ties. But beyond its shores the world was shifting. A storm had been gathering in the vast steppes of Asia, sweeping east with quiet momentum. It was the Mongol Empire, Under the leadership of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, the Mongols had already conquered vast territories, from China to Central Asia, from Korea to parts of Eastern Europe. Their forces moved not like traditional armies, but like wind, fast, adaptive, brutal, and now Kublai's eyes had turned to Japan. In 1268, an envoy arrived at the Japanese court bearing gifts and a warning. The Mongols, the letter said, requested Japan's submission. They proposed diplomacy, but beneath the carefully chosen words there was a clear message: submit or be swept aside. The court was divided. Some feared the wrath of the Khan. Others hesitated, unsure how to respond to such a foreign challenge. But Tokimune did not waver. He refused, not loudly, not with boasts, but with a single decision. No reply would be sent. And when the Mongols sent more envoys, Tokimune had them sent away. Still the letters came. In 1274, Kublai sent his first armada. Nearly 1,000 ships, over 20,000 men. Mongol, Korean, and Chinese forces, armed with advanced weapons, poisons, and firebombs. They landed on the island of Tsushima, then moved to Iki, and finally Kyushu. The Japanese defenders, brave but fewer in number, fought back with traditional weapons and localized strategies. For days chaos reigned, villages burned, temples fell. But then, suddenly, the invaders began to retreat. A great storm, violent, unexpected, tore across the strait. Ships were wrecked, soldiers drowned. The Mongol fleet was scattered and forced to withdraw. Some in Japan saw it as divine intervention, a kamikaze, divine wind, sent by the gods to protect their homeland. But Tokimune did not wait for storms. He knew they would return. Over the next several years, he ordered massive defensive reforms. Fortified walls were built along Kyushu's coast. Samurai units were trained and rotated regularly. Communications were streamlined, and most importantly, a national spirit of vigilance was cultivated, not through fear but through quiet readiness. In 2081, the Mongols returned. This time, they brought an even greater force. Nearly 40,000 men split across two armadas. They approached from China and Korea, planning to converge on Hakata Bay. The defenders waited behind newly built walls, armed with improved weapons and coordinated strategy. The Japanese Navy, though small, harassed the enemy fleet constantly, using fire ships, small raiding boats, and night assaults to prevent them from forming a stable beachhead. And once again the sea turned. A typhoon, far stronger than the last, roared through the strait. Ships capsized in the dark. Thousands were lost. The Mongol fleet was devastated. Survivors fled. Kublai Khan would never attempt a third invasion. Tokimune did not celebrate with banners or monuments. He thanked the gods. Yes, but he also thanked the people, the samurai, the monks, the shipbuilders, all who had stood without flinching. Privately, he turned inward. The strain of those years had pressed deeply into his spirit. He turned increasingly to Zen Buddhism, seeking not escape but understanding. He built temples, he practiced meditation, and when asked how he had faced such pressure, he gave no long answer. I meditated, he said simply, until all fear dissolved. Tokimune died in 1284, only 3 years after the final invasion. He was 33, young by any measure. But in his brief life, he had preserved not only the independence of a nation, but the integrity of its identity. Japan would go untouched by foreign invasion for nearly 6 more centuries. And to this day, in the memory of 2 great storms, there lingers the quiet voice of a man who stood at the center of uncertainty and never once raised it. Hojo Tokimune, the regent who ruled not by sword but by steadiness, who faced the mightiest empire of his age, and answered only with calm. As your eyes grow heavy, imagine that coastline once more, stone walls rising above the tide, samurai standing motionless in the dawn fog, and beyond them, the horizon, holding no ships, only clouds. Let that stillness hold you tonight. Let it be your shield, for sometimes the greatest leaders do not raise armies. They raise stillness. They raise will, and when the storm comes, they do not blink. Long after the last shots of war have faded into the sea, and the steel hulls of battleships rest in museum silence, one name still echoes gently across the wide blue of the Pacific, not with fanfare, but with depth. For in the greatest naval conflict the world had ever seen, it was not a man of fury who guided the helm, but a man of balance, Chester William Nimitz, the admiral who turned tides, not by storm, but by stillness, the Pacific's quiet command. He was born in Fredericksburg, Texas, in 1885, far from any ocean, among fields and hills more accustomed to cattle than carriers. His grandfather, a German immigrant, had once told him, "The sea, like life, gives nothing for free, but it rewards those who understand its silence." At age 15, Nimitz was appointed to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. He graduated in 1905, seventh in his class, and began his career at sea, with a blend of precision and humility. In those early years, Nimitz was not flashy. He preferred engineering rooms to command decks. He studied engines, propulsion, and logistics, the unseen forces behind naval movement. He understood that a fleet was not a symbol but a system, a delicate machine, powered not by glory but by order. He served quietly through the First World War and into the interwar years, gradually earning the respect of peers and subordinates alike. What distinguished him was never volume, it was vision. Where others saw ships, he saw infrastructure. Where others saw setbacks, he saw the next adjustment. He had a gift for clarity in chaos, and a gentleness that steadied even the most anxious minds. Then came Pearl Harbor. December 2nd. In a single morning, the Pacific Fleet was devastated. Battleships lay burning. Morale collapsed. The United States, long hesitant, was suddenly at war, and into this storm, barely 3 weeks later, Nimitz was summoned. He was offered the command of the Pacific Fleet, a broken, grieving force. A lesser man might have hesitated, might have sought revenge, or retreat. Nimitz arrived quietly. He was sworn in on the deck of a submarine, not for ceremony, but because there were few ships still fit for anything else. What followed was one of the most remarkable naval rebuilds in history. Nimitz understood that victory would not come through sheer power alone. It would require coordination across thousands of miles, between nations, cultures, and personalities. He would need to manage not just ships, but time and trust. He nurtured leaders like Spruance and Halsey. He gave room for brilliance, while never surrendering clarity. He navigated between the brash calls of Washington and the hard realities of open sea warfare. Every island seized, every convoy launched, every carrier strike was shaped, at least in part, by Nimitz's invisible hand. And at the heart of that hand was Midway. It was in June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, that Japan launched a strike against the tiny island of Midway. Their aim was to finish what they had begun, to draw out and destroy the remainder of the U.S. carriers. But thanks to American codebreakers, Nimitz knew their plan. Rather than defend blindly, he positioned his fleet strategically. He placed faith in his commanders, especially the reserved and thoughtful Spruance, and allowed the moment to unfold. The result was a staggering Japanese defeat. 4 of their carriers, the same that had struck Pearl Harbor, were lost. Midway was not merely a tactical win. It was a shift in momentum. The Pacific was no longer theirs. Over the next 3 years, Nimitz would oversee a relentless campaign of island hopping, moving through the Central Pacific, capturing key outposts, building forward bases, pushing ever closer to Japan. The distances were immense, the stakes unthinkable, yet through it all his tone remained even. He was known for handwritten notes, for quiet tours of ships, for listening before speaking, and when tragedy struck, as it often did, he mourned privately, then resumed the work. By 1945, American forces had reached the doorstep of Japan. The cost had been high, and the shadow of nuclear weapons now loomed. As the war drew to a close, it was Nimitz who was chosen to represent the Navy at the formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. He stood quietly, hands behind his back, beside General MacArthur. No grand gestures, no triumphal words, just presence. After the war, Nimitz resisted celebration. He spoke of sacrifice, of service, of the lives that would never return home. He later helped oversee the rebuilding of Japan's maritime industry, advocating for peace and cooperation. To him, the sea was not a border, it was a bridge. He retired from active duty in 1947 and lived the rest of his life modestly in California. When asked once how he led such an enormous war effort, he answered simply, "I made decisions, then I trusted good men to carry them out." Chester Nimitz died in 1966 and was buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery, near the Pacific he had loved and the men he had led. No statue was needed. His legacy was written in the balance he maintained, the storms he guided through, the calm he carried within. As you lie now beneath your own quiet sky, imagine the vast Pacific once more, not as battlefield, but as horizon. Endless, open, and slow. See the silhouette of ships gliding forward, silent and sure. And on the bridge, a man, still composed, watching not just the sea ahead, but the men beside him. Let his steadiness find you tonight. Let it carry you where no map can reach. For in the long arc of war, some steer with fire, and others with faith. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the quiet helm of the Pacific. The shores of ancient Attica lie quiet now, their olive trees stirring gently in the sea breeze, their white stones warm beneath the sun. But long ago, before marble temples crowned the hills and philosophy gave Athens its voice, there came a moment when the very soul of Greece stood on the edge of the sea, watching, waiting, and then sailing forward under the guidance of one man who saw farther than most. Themistocles, not a king, not a general by birth, but a citizen whose mind became the keel upon which a city was saved. He was born around 544 BCE in the humble districts of Athens. His family was of modest status, and unlike the nobility who traced their bloodlines to heroes, Themistocles rose from lower ranks, driven by something both urgent and rare, vision. From his youth, he understood that Athens was more than land. It was a people shaped by the sea, a city open to winds of trade and culture. He believed that the strength of such a place would not come from spears and shields alone, but from ships, and not just for fishing or commerce, but for defense. That belief would shape the fate of an entire civilization. In the early 5th century BCE, Athens and the rest of the Greek world faced a storm from the east, the vast empire of Persia. Under King Darius, the Persians had already struck at Greek territories, only to be repelled at the famous Battle of Marathon. But Themistocles, unlike many of his peers, knew that victory had only delayed the inevitable. A second invasion would come, and it would be larger, more devastating. So he began to prepare. While others debated temples and taxes, Themistocles turned to the sea. In 4083 BCE, Athens discovered a new silver vein in the mines at Laurium. The assembly wished to distribute the wealth among citizens, but Themistocles persuaded them, urgently and cleverly, to use the windfall to build ships, triremes, fast, sleek warships with 3 rows of oars, bronze-plated rams, and unmatched maneuverability. By the time Xerxes, son of Darius, launched his massive invasion in 480 BCE, said to be the largest army the world had yet seen, Athens had over 200 triremes ready. The Persians swept across northern Greece. Many city-states submitted, others fell. The Greeks who resisted formed an uneasy alliance. Sparta led on land, while Athens commanded the sea. Themistocles understood the stakes, and he understood that Athens, surrounded and vulnerable, could not be defended by walls alone. So he made a fateful decision to abandon the city. The people of Athens, At his urging, evacuated by sea, thousands crammed into boats, fleeing to nearby islands. It was not surrender, it was strategy. The city itself was sacrificed, but its spirit remained afloat, armed and waiting. The Persian army marched into the empty city and burned it. But the sea still belonged to the Greeks. Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the Attic coast. There, their numbers became a liability. Their large, unwieldy ships could not maneuver in the tight passage, and at dawn, the Athenian-led fleet struck. The Battle of Salamis was chaos and brilliance. Oars clashed. Rams pierced hulls. Voices rose across the water like wind before a storm. And through it all, Themistocles directed the rhythm, not from pride, but from clarity. He had studied these waters. He had planned this trap. And now, it closed with force. By sunset, the Persian fleet was in ruins. Xerxes, watching from a throne on the cliffs, saw not just ships destroyed, but his grand campaign unraveling. He withdrew shortly after. It was one of the greatest naval upsets in history, and it had been won not through strength alone, but through foresight. Yet Themistocles' triumph would not last. In the years that followed, politics in Athens turned. His growing influence, his proud nature, and his reforms, which shifted power away from aristocrats, stirred resentment. His enemies accused him of arrogance, of corruption, of ambition. Eventually, he was ostracized, exiled from the very city he had saved. He wandered through the Greek world unwelcome, misunderstood, and in one of history's strangest turns, he ended his days in Persia. Offered refuge by the same empire he had once outwitted, there in distant lands he lived quietly until his death. Some say he died of illness, others whisper he took poison, unwilling to be used as a symbol by those he once defeated. But history has a longer memory than politics. Themistocles was not just a commander. He was a strategist, a builder, a reader of tides. He saw that navies are not born in battle, but in vision. That courage is not only standing your ground, but knowing when to move, when to retreat, when to let the enemy come forward, blinded by their own size. He gave Athens its fleet. He gave Greece its turning point. And he gave the world a lesson. It still studies that the sea rewards not the strongest, but the sharpest. So as the night deepens around you, close your eyes and drift back to those straits, where bronze-tipped ships slice through the water, where shouts echo across the dawn mist, and where a single man, standing at the prow, watches not the present, but what lies just ahead. The master, the citizen who became a compass, who taught a city to sail and a continent to stand. Let his wisdom hold your dreams steady tonight. For sometimes the greatest victories are not seen in fire, but in the quiet space between waves, where foresight waits like a wind, ready to rise. When the sun sets over the Ligurian coast, painting Genoa in amber light, the waters in the harbor seem to remember a time when oaths were forged not in ink, but in wind and salt. There was once a man who stood at the helm of such winds, his eyes older than his years, his loyalty given not to kings or empires, but to the endurance of his city. Andrea Doria, the admiral who never ruled yet steered a republic, the last great seafarer of the Renaissance world. He was born in 1466 into a fading branch of an ancient Genoese family. Orphaned at a young age, Andrea was shaped not by wealth but by hardship. His hands became familiar with ropes and rigging long before they touched titles. The Mediterranean was not just a sea to him, it was his inheritance, his battlefield, and his companion. In those days, Genoa was a fractured republic, caught between greater powers. Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Ottomans vied endlessly across the water. Alliances shifted, and in this churning sea of politics and piracy, Andrea rose, not through birthright, but through brilliance. He began as a soldier, then turned to naval command. And it was there, aboard wooden decks and storm-washed masts, that his legend grew. Doria fought corsairs along the Barbary coast. He battled the French, served the Papal States, and later Spain. He won not only by sword, but by the strength of discipline. His crews were known for order, his ships for agility, and his judgment for precision. And unlike many commanders of his era, he did not hunger for plunder. His goal was always Genoa, its autonomy, its dignity. In 1528, the city was in turmoil. France had occupied it. Its once proud government had collapsed under foreign weight. Doria, long serving France as an admiral, saw an opening, but not for himself. He broke with the French king Charles VIII and offered his services instead to Charles V of Holy Roman Empire. In return, Doria demanded one thing: that Genoa be free. With a fleet of imperial ships, he sailed into the Genoese harbor. There was no bloodshed. The French garrison withdrew, and the republic, tattered but breathing, was restored. Andrea Doria could have seized power then. He could have crowned himself. He did not. Instead, he rewrote Genoa's constitution. He established a senate, term limits, and protections against corruption. He declined kingship, choosing instead the title Father and Defender of the Republic. And though he never held office, his presence was felt in every decision, every policy, every quiet turn of state. He continued to command fleets well into his 70s, at Lepanto, at Preveza, and across dozens of lesser-known but vital engagements. He led Christian forces against Ottoman expansion. He did not always win, but he always endured. More than his victories, it was his steadiness that defined him. Where others ruled by flame, he ruled by presence. He understood that the sea is both opportunity and threat. That freedom, once bought, must be guarded, not just with weapons but with wisdom. He died in 1560, at the remarkable age of 94. The bells of Genoa rang for a week, but there were no golden statues, no empires built in his name. His tomb rests in the church of San Matteo, beside the family he had elevated not by blood, but by honor. Today, his legacy is quieter than many. He is not as famous as Nelson, or as mythic as Themistocles, but across the pages of European history, his name lingers like a steady wind, constant, if not loud. Andrea Doria was the last of a certain kind, a Renaissance man in the truest sense, not of art, but of balance. He moved between war and peace, politics and loyalty, not as a chess player, but as a steward. And Genoa, the city he loved, flourished under his watch. As the night wraps gently around you now, imagine those Mediterranean waters, darker, deeper than they appear. Hear the faint cry of gulls overhead, the hush of sails unfurling under starlight, and at the center, an old man with silver hair, standing alone at the stern. He does not smile, he does not rest, for his city still breathes, and the sea still shifts. Andrea Doria, admiral without a crown, who proved that strength could wear humility, and that service, quiet, firm, enduring, can outlive any throne. Let his steadiness guide your thoughts as you drift, for some men do not seek to command the world, only to protect a piece of it. When the early morning mist gathers over the harbors of Nanjing, it curls quietly around the stone docks and aged wooden piers like memory taking shape. It whispers of ships the size of villages, sails rising like temples into the sky, and fleets so vast they seemed more like floating cities than mere convoys. And in the stillness, one name comes gently back to the surface, not as a conqueror, but as a voyager. Jing He, the admiral who steered the might of Ming China across the edge of the known world, a Muslim eunuch from Yunnan, transformed into the grand ambassador of the sea. He was born around 1371, in a remote part of southwestern China, into a Hu Muslim family. His birth name was Ma He. His early life was marked not by promise, but by upheaval. When Ming forces subdued Yunnan, the young boy was captured, castrated, and sent to serve in the imperial court. He became a eunuch, not by choice but by fate. Yet in the emperor's palace, destiny bent once more. There, he caught the attention of Zhu Di, a prince of sharp mind and vast ambition. The two formed a bond built on trust and utility, and when Zhu Di seized the throne in 1402, becoming the Yongle emperor, he elevated Ma He with him, giving him the honorific Zheng and appointing him to a title unseen in previous dynasties. Grand Director of the Treasure Fleet, it was a role unlike any before it, and it would launch a journey unlike any since. The emperor envisioned a China, not isolated behind walls, but reaching outward, reclaiming its place at the center of the world's currents. Zheng He was chosen to lead this vision, not as a mere captain, but as an emissary of power, generosity, and presence. The first expedition departed in over 300 ships, nearly 28,000. It was the largest naval fleet the world had ever seen. And these were not warships alone. They were treasure ships, Chuan, some over 400 feet long, with vast cargo holds and multiple decks. They carried silk and porcelain, spices and jade, lacquered goods and letters of goodwill. With these, Zheng He sailed across the South China Sea, down through the Strait of Malacca, and into the Indian Ocean. Over the next 3 decades, he would complete 7 major voyages, touching the shores of what is now Indonesia, Malaysia, India, Sri Lanka, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Swahili coast of Africa. In each port, he left gifts, negotiated treaties and exchanged cultures. In some cases, he brought local rulers back to China to pay homage to the emperor. In others, he helped resolve disputes or simply observed the customs of foreign courts. But these missions were not conquests. They were gestures of legitimacy. China did not seek to colonize, but to be seen. Zheng He was a diplomat at sea, a bearer of goodwill backed by overwhelming presence. His crews built mosques in foreign lands. His translators documented dozens of languages. His navigators mapped stars known only to Indian fishermen or Arab merchants. And through it all, he remained loyal to his dual identities, a servant of the emperor and a Muslim in foreign lands. He prayed in ports where the call to prayer rose with the scent of myrrh. He offered sacrifices at Buddhist temples. He lit incense in Confucian halls. His belief was never in domination, but in recognition. Yet back in China, tides were changing. The later Ming emperors grew wary of foreign influence. Confucian scholars, who valued order and self-reliance, criticized the expense of these grand expeditions. Why reach outward, they asked, when all that matters lies within? By the time Zheng He completed his 7th and final voyage in 1433, the court was shifting inward. The great ships were left to rot. Shipyards were dismantled, naval records were sealed, and the age of Chinese maritime exploration came to a quiet end. Zheng He died shortly after that last voyage, perhaps at sea, or shortly after returning to Nanjing. His grave, if it exists, remains unconfirmed. Some believe his body was buried in a simple tomb on a hillside overlooking the Yangtze. Others say he rests somewhere beneath the waters he knew best. Yet in the centuries that followed, stories of his voyages persisted, not only in Chinese scrolls but in the oral histories of African traders, Arab chroniclers, and Southeast Asian fishermen. His memory survived not as a conqueror, but as a bridge. He showed the world that an empire could sail not only with swords, but with gifts. Not only to demand, but to exchange. In the modern era, as ships traverse the same seas he once sailed, his name has returned, carved into schools, streets, and naval vessels. But perhaps his greatest legacy lies not in any monument, but in the idea that peace too can arrive with sails raised. As night deepens around you now, picture the Indian Ocean in moonlight. See the silhouette of towering masts, the slow curve of the hull as it rocks gently in tide. Smell sandalwood and salt. Hear the rustle of silk cargo. And above it all, on the upper deck, a man stands watching the horizon. He is neither king nor warrior. He carries no throne. But within him is the weight of civilization, balanced quietly on the breath of wind. Zheng He. the admiral who stitched together continents not with conquest, but with curiosity. Let his voyages guide your dreams gently tonight. For sometimes, the bravest thing a fleet can carry is friendship. The early mornings along the Atlantic coast of France often arrive shrouded in mist, a soft, silvery veil that quiets the sea and swallows the outlines of ships. Beneath that stillness lies a history far more tangled than the fog suggests, a time when loyalty was a shifting tide, and the sea itself became a mirror of uncertainty. And in that haze one figure emerges clear to some, blurred to others, François Darlan, the admiral who straddled empires, oaths and choices few could bear. Not remembered for conquest, but for the uneasy weight of wartime command. Born in 1881 in the southern city of Nérac, Darlan's beginnings were shaped by ambition and precision. He was not aristocratic, nor flamboyant, but from his earliest naval days he displayed a sharp intellect and an unwavering belief in order. He graduated from the École Naval near the top of his class, and rose steadily, mastering the logistics of fleets, the rhythms of command, and the political waters that so often ran beneath military ones. By the 1930s, as storm clouds darkened Europe once again, Darlan had risen to Admiral of the Fleet and later Chief of Naval Staff. In these years he modernized the French Navy, anticipating that the oceans would once again become theaters of great consequence. He was not a romantic sailor. His thinking was technical, methodical, and deeply nationalist. France, in his mind, must always preserve its sovereignty at sea, even in alliance. Then came the fall of France. It happened with a swiftness that shocked the world. German forces surged through the Ardennes, bypassing the vaunted Maginot Line, and within weeks, Paris was occupied. The armistice was signed. The country split, the north under German control, the south governed by the so-called Vichy regime, and the French fleet, second only to Britain's in size, found itself suddenly unmoored. Darlan now commanded a navy without a war. Bound by an armistice, he was ordered to prevent French ships from falling into Allied hands, but he also refused to allow them to serve Germany. This delicate, defiant stance would soon put him at the center of one of the war's most tragic episodes. In July 1940, fearing that the French fleet might be seized by Axis forces, the British Royal Navy launched Operation Catapult, a surprise attack on the French squadron anchored at Mers el-Kébir, off the Algerian coast. Over 1,300 French sailors were killed. The ships were destroyed or damaged. The French public was outraged. Darlan, until then sympathetic to Britain, hardened. He drew the fleet closer to Vichy, swearing to preserve French naval power, not for Hitler, but for France itself. It was a dangerous path. Between 1940 and 1942, Darlan became a key figure in the Vichy regime. Though he never embraced fascism, he accepted German influence, hoping, some say, to retain leverage for a future reversal. He was both deputy to Marshal Pétain and commander of the fleet. He maintained contact with German officials while quietly resisting some demands. To many, he appeared as a man walking two roads, hoping they might converge. Then in November 1942, the world shifted again. The Allies launched Operation Torch, an invasion of North Africa. American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, seeking to establish a foothold for the push into Europe. Darlan happened to be in Algiers at the time, visiting his ill son. The Allies, realizing the opportunity, opened negotiations with him directly. It was controversial and unprecedented. Within days, Darlan agreed to a ceasefire, ordering French forces in North Africa to stand down and cooperate with the Allies. He declared himself High Commissioner of France in Africa. In return, the Allies recognized his authority, hoping it would ease the transition. To many in the resistance, and even in Washington and London, this felt like a moral compromise. Darlan, after all, had been a pillar of Vichy. He had upheld its policies. He had stood silently during its darkest hours. But to Eisenhower and his commanders on the ground, the goal was practical: save lives, gain ground, and shift momentum. It was a decision made in the fog of war. But the fog did not last. On December 24, 1942, just weeks after his new role began, François Darlan was assassinated in Algiers by a young monarchist named Fernand Bernier de la Chapelle. His motivations were complex, born of ideology, resentment, and the chaos of war. Darlan died quickly, and with him vanished one of the most enigmatic figures of the war. No monuments would be built in his name, no songs written, no clear legacy carved. He was neither hero nor villain in any pure sense. He preserved the fleet, but swore to Vichy. He enabled the Allies, but had collaborated with Axis terms. Some call him a pragmatist, others an opportunist. But perhaps he was simply a man caught in a tide that no map could chart, where every direction was loss, and the only compass left was survival. Today, the name François Darlan is rarely spoken outside of history books. His choices are debated still, often in footnotes, often with discomfort. Yet within that discomfort lies the very thing that makes history real. The reminder that some decisions are made not in light, but in shadow, and that the sea, for all its clarity, sometimes holds no safe course at all. As the night deepens around you now, imagine the darkened harbor of Algiers. December winds rustling the flags, the hulls of ships creaking softly in their moorings. Somewhere in the streets footsteps echo briefly, then fade, and on a quiet desk papers await a signature that never comes. François Darlan, the admiral who stood between surrender and command, between silence and decision. Let his story carry you softly tonight. For not all sailors sail with certainty. Some must choose through fog, and still, they sail. When the wind presses against the eastern shores of Scotland or stirs the waves off the coast of France, somewhere within its sound is the faint echo of a battle cry, not screamed in anger, but spoken in defiance, a voice weathered by salt, steeled by silence, and remembered not for a nation, but for the sheer refusal to retreat. John Paul Jones, the father of the American Navy, and the sailor who made the sea his only allegiance. He was born in 1747 in Kirkcudbrightshire, Scotland, near the Solway Firth, where the sea whispers inlets into the land. His name then was simply John Paul. His father was a gardener, and the world around him was hard, narrow, and quiet, but the sea was always there, vast, unpredictable, and promising. At age 13, he went to sea as an apprentice aboard a merchant ship. In those years, the Atlantic was a place of commerce and cruelty. Jones learned the trade routes, the winds, and the realities of the slave trade. He saw its horrors firsthand and soon rejected it, vowing to never again serve aboard such ships. He rose quickly, becoming a captain by his early 20s, but storms gathered on the horizon, not at sea but on land. In 1773, after a dispute with a mutinous sailor who later died, Jones fled Scotland, fearing retribution. He added Jones to his name and disappeared into the colonies, a man without a country, but with a deepening sense of purpose. And it was there, in the American colonies on the edge of rebellion, that fate and ocean finally met. When the American Revolution began, John Paul Jones volunteered for the Continental Navy. To some, he was a foreigner, to others, a man of mystery. But on the water, none could question his resolve. He was given command of a small ship, the Providence, and soon proved himself more than capable. Bold, precise, tireless, he harassed British convoys, captured prizes, and patrolled the cold northern waters with quiet ferocity. But Jones was not content with coastal raids. He believed that the young American Navy must strike at Britain itself, not just its ships but its coasts. It was an idea dismissed by many as fantasy, yet in 1778, with the help of French allies, Jones set out across the Atlantic with a ragtag squadron of ships. His flagship was the Bonhomme Richard, an aging vessel named in honor of Benjamin Franklin. Its hull creaked, its guns were mismatched, but it carried within it something more powerful than iron, conviction. In September 1779, off the coast of Flamborough Head in Yorkshire, Jones met the British warship Serapis. The battle that followed would become legend. The Serapis was larger, faster, and more heavily armed. It struck first, tearing through the Bonhomme Richard with brutal force. Fires broke out, masts cracked. Below deck, sailors screamed through smoke and shrapnel. A British officer reportedly shouted across the waves, "Do you strike your colors?" And from the ruined deck, through firelight and blood, came the answer, calm, clear, and unbroken. "I have not yet begun to fight." Jones lashed his failing ship to the Serapis. They were locked together now, unable to separate a violent embrace at sea. His men swarmed the enemy deck, and in brutal close combat, they forced the British to surrender. The Bonhomme Richard was lost. It sank not long after, but Jones remained afloat, victorious. The battle sent shockwaves through Europe. It was the first time an American-led force had defeated the British Navy in its own waters. For many, it was symbolic, a flicker of something impossible, that a nation still in its infancy could command the sea. But for Jones, it was never about banners or applause. It was about mastery. Of the ship, of the sea, of the self. He continued to serve through the remainder of the war, often caught between praise and politics. His ambition unnerved some, his foreign origins others, yet none doubted his ability. He sailed as far as the West Indies, raiding British shipping lanes, and returned often with more prisoners than crew. After the war, when America had no more need for heroes, Jones drifted once more, not into obscurity but into exile. In 1788, he entered the service of Empress Catherine the Great of Russia. He commanded a fleet on the Black Sea during the Russo-Turkish War, gaining victories, but also enemies. The Russian court, wary of his pride and popularity, eventually forced his retirement. He returned to Paris, aging and unwell. There, in a quiet apartment, he died alone in 1792 at the age of 45. He was buried in an unmarked grave, beneath the shifting sands of memory. But memory has a current all its own. In 1905, more than a century after his death, his remains were found, exhumed, and returned to the United States. With full military honors, he was reinterred at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, beneath marble and beneath silence. Today, cadets still pass beneath his tomb. Ships still sail, bearing his name, and in the mind of every sailor who learns not to yield, there echoes a voice, not loud, but lasting. "I have not yet begun to fight." John Paul Jones remains a symbol not just of naval excellence, but of sheer will, of how a man without a nation made himself a legend, not by command, but by refusal. Refusal to give in, refusal to be forgotten, refusal to strike the flag before the last breath. And so, as the night drifts softly across your thoughts, imagine the North Sea, cold, bracing, endless. The creak of wood, the burn of salt in the wind, a broken mast silhouetted against moonlight. And amid the smoke, a single man standing still, daring the storm to strike again. Let his resolve settle within you. Let his defiance rock you gently toward rest. For there are some who sleep not in peace, but in purpose. John Paul Jones, the sailor who would not surrender, and never did. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the waves of the Pacific lie hushed beneath the first light, there remains the echo of an intellect too sharp for its own time. A man who charted futures with precision, who held the pulse of empires in his hand, and yet could not stop the winds he had helped unleash, is Oroku Yamamoto, the admiral who understood both the sword and its consequences, a tactician revered for brilliance and haunted by foresight. He was born in 1884, in the remote coastal town of Nagaoka, a land still carrying the soot and sorrow of civil war. His family was samurai by heritage, though fallen in fortune. Young Isoroku, whose name marked his father's age of 60 at the time of his birth, came of age in a Japan that was rapidly transforming, blending tradition with industrial ambition. Drawn to the sea, he enrolled in the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy and graduated with distinction. His early career brought him to battleships and foreign waters, but it was not just naval maneuvers that interested him. Yamamoto sought to understand the minds behind war, its roots, its machinery, its math. In 1919, he traveled to the United States to study at Harvard University. He learned fluent English, explored American culture, and developed a respect for its industrial power. Later, he served as naval attaché in Washington, observing firsthand the vastness of American resources and the resilience of its people. He admired the country's dynamism, but it filled him with quiet dread. He once said plainly, "Anyone who has seen the United States knows that she cannot be beaten." This was not defeatism, it was clarity. By the 1930s, Yamamoto had risen to Vice Minister of the Navy and later Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. He was skeptical of Japan's increasing militarism and the growing influence of ultranationalists in government. He opposed the invasion of China. He feared war with America, but he was bound, as all soldiers are, to obey. And when diplomacy fractured entirely in 1941 and Japan prepared to strike, it was Yamamoto they turned to. The plan he proposed was bold, devastating, and deeply reluctant. If war was to come, he argued, it must begin with a blow so severe it would cripple America's ability to respond, at least long enough for Japan to consolidate its position across the Pacific. Thus was born the plan to attack Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, just after sunrise, Japanese aircraft swept across the Hawaiian sky. Battleships burned, airfields were shattered, thousands were killed, and the Pacific, once a stretch of blue silence, became a theater of fire. The attack was tactically brilliant. Strategically, it was a sentence, because Yamamoto knew what would follow. He is said to have remarked afterward, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he truly spoke those words or not, the sentiment was real. The initial victory would not endure. In the months that followed, Yamamoto oversaw further campaigns, the advance through the Philippines, the sweep into the East Indies, the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway. But the tide was shifting. Midway in June 1942 was a turning point. Yamamoto devised an elaborate plan to lure American carriers into a trap. But American cryptographers had broken Japanese codes. The trap turned inward. 4 Japanese carriers were lost. The initiative slipped, and with it the war's momentum. Still, Yamamoto remained calm, committed and composed. He continued to rally the fleet, to visit the front lines, to offer presence where optimism had dimmed. He did not rage, he did not retreat, but those closest to him saw the wear. In April 1943, seeking to boost morale and inspect air bases in the Solomon Islands, Yamamoto scheduled a tour by aircraft. His itinerary, transmitted in coded radio messages, was intercepted by American intelligence. On April 18, in Operation Vengeance, U.S. fighters intercepted his plane over Bougainville. It was shot down over the jungle. The man who had lived his life at sea, who had mapped battles across thousands of miles of ocean, now lay beneath the canopy, still, solitary, and gone. He was 59. Japan mourned him as a hero. A state funeral was held. His ashes were scattered at sea, the only grave a sailor like Yamamoto would ever need. But history has not easily defined him. He was not a warmonger, nor a pacifist. He was a servant of duty, a strategist bound by circumstance, a man who understood the cost of conflict before it began, and yet led the charge because that was the role given. He was shaped not by bloodlust, but by calculus. And his sorrow lay not in hesitation, but in certainty. Today, when historians look back on the Pacific War, Yamamoto is remembered not only for Pearl Harbor but for the warning in his eyes, the grim steadiness in his decisions, and the lingering question he leaves behind. What if brilliance is not enough to stop a war, only to win the first battles of it? As the night grows quiet, and the stars mirror the scattered lights of ships lost to time, imagine a map stretched across a broad desk, filled with lines, currents, codes. Imagine a hand tracing those lines, not with hope, but with resolve. Isoroku Yamamoto, the admiral who saw too far, whose mind sailed past victories into consequences, and who, even in silence, whispers through the currents of history. War is not won in brilliance alone. It is remembered by those who foresaw its price. Let his quiet gravity guide your thoughts as you drift. For there are leaders who roar, and those who, with a steady breath, bear the burden of knowing what must come. There are certain names whispered in the halls of naval academies, not with awe alone, but with a kind of reverence reserved for those who seem to command more than ships, who seem to shape the very waters they sailed. Among them stands a man from a small island nation who stunned the world and redefined what it meant to be a maritime power. Togo Heihachiro, the admiral who defeated an empire at sea, the silent strategist who steered Japan into the modern age. He was born in 1848 in the city of Kagoshima, nestled at the southern tip of Kyushu. At the time, Japan was still a feudal archipelago ruled by shoguns and samurai. But winds of change had begun to stir. Commodore Perry had arrived. Steamships were appearing in foreign harbors. The world was expanding, and Japan, proud and ancient, was watching carefully. Young Togo came of age at the edge of this transformation. A samurai by birth, he was not destined for swords alone. When the newly restored Meiji government sent promising students abroad, he was among them. He sailed to England, a journey that would change the course of his life. There, in the quiet fog of Portsmouth and the lecture halls of naval academies, he studied not only seamanship, but patience. He absorbed Western tactics. He examined engineering, discipline, naval gunnery. He did not speak often, but he listened deeply, and when he returned to Japan years later, he carried with him more than knowledge. He carried a vision. Japan, he believed, must build a navy, not in imitation, but in principle, rooted in tradition, yet reaching outward. And when the hour of testing came, that navy would not shrink before giants. By the dawn of the 20th century, Togo had risen quietly through the ranks. He commanded with restraint, demanded rigor, and rarely raised his voice. But those who served under him spoke of a gaze that could weigh a man's conviction more swiftly than any speech. In 1904, the challenge he had long foreseen arrived. The Russo-Japanese War. Russia, vast and imperial, had pushed eastward into Manchuria and Korea, clashing with Japan's growing influence. The world watched, assuming the island nation would be overpowered, yet Togo saw something different. With the Japanese fleet under his command, he struck first. At Port Arthur, he launched a surprise attack on Russian ships at anchor, disabling but not destroying. It was only the beginning. In the months that followed, battles flared across the Yellow Sea. Japanese forces, coordinated and disciplined, slowly wore down the larger Russian fleet. But Togo knew the war would be decided not by skirmishes, but by one conclusive moment. It came in May 1905, the Battle of Tsushima. The Russian Baltic Fleet, after sailing halfway around the globe, approached the Tsushima Strait. Their ships were exhausted, their morale fragile, yet they still outnumbered the Japanese in size and tonnage. The world again assumed victory lay with the Russians. But Togo had prepared. He had studied the route. He had trained his gunners, rehearsed formations, and timed the wind. As the Russian fleet entered the strait, Togo raised his signal flags. His ships shifted position, executing a rare and difficult maneuver, a turn across the enemy's line of advance, placing his entire fleet in position to deliver a full, devastating broadside. It was a moment of naval brilliance, unmatched in the modern era. The Russians were stunned. Their line broke. And for 2 days, Togo's fleet pursued and dismantled them. Of the 38 Russian ships, nearly all were sunk, captured, or forced aground. Over 5,000 Russian sailors perished. Japan lost just 3 torpedo boats. The victory was absolute. It was the first time in modern history that an Asian power had defeated a European empire in open war. News of the battle rippled across the globe. In London, in Berlin, in Washington, silence followed admiration. Togo was called the Nelson of the East, though those who understood him knew better. Where Nelson had led with charisma, Togo led with calm. Where others shouted commands, he delivered them softly. He believed that the sea respected silence, and that victory belonged to those who met battle without trembling. Following the war, Togo became a symbol not only of Japan's rise, but of strategic mastery. He was named Chief of the Naval General Staff, elevated to the peerage, and honored by foreign powers. Yet he remained distant from politics. His loyalty remained to the fleet, to the emperor, and to the deep. In 1926, as the shadows of his life began to lengthen, he was asked to serve one final role, tutor to Crown Prince Hirohito. Not in textbooks, but in character, in humility, in the weight of responsibility. He died the following year, at the age of 79. The streets of Tokyo were silent as his funeral procession passed. Battleships fired salutes across Tokyo Bay, and though the ships of his era had long been replaced, none could replace the stillness he left behind. Today, Togo is remembered, not just in Japan, but across naval history, as a man who changed the order of the world without needing to say so. His face appears in statues and portraits. His writings are studied. But more than any monument, his greatest echo lies in the waters where he once stood. The Tsushima Strait, still silent, still deep, remembers, and in that memory, the lesson endures, that strength does not roar, that victory does not require volume, and that the sharpest sword may be sheathed in calm. Now, as the night wraps gently around your senses, imagine the cool breeze off the Sea of Japan. Hear the low hum of engines, the rhythm of waves tapping steel, and above it all, a quiet man in uniform, watching the horizon, not with glory but with understanding. Togo Heihachiro, the admiral who stilled the sea and proved that presence could be power. Let his calm guide your thoughts tonight, as dreams drift with the tide, steady, silent, certain. At times, when the English Channel falls quiet, when the winds soften against the sails of memory, a single name floats above the mist, wrapped not in legend alone, but in a deeper, humbler truth, a truth about sacrifice, brilliance, and devotion without end. Horatio Nelson, the admiral who gave all he had, and more, a sailor whose soul remained at sea, even when his body could not. He was born in 1758, in Norfolk, in the small village of Burnham Thorpe. His early life was modest. The son of a country clergyman, his strength was never in stature. He was sickly as a child, slight in build, and prone to weakness. But the sea seemed to steady him. At age 12, he joined the Royal Navy under the protection of an uncle, and in the years that followed, his rise was not smooth but undeniable. He served in the West Indies, in the Arctic, in India, absorbing every lesson the waves had to offer. He was not beloved for charm. He was not born into grandeur, but he held a rare clarity about duty, about tactics, about the emotional weight of command. And even early on, there was something else, a presence, as if the sea itself took him seriously. In battle, Nelson was fearless, not recklessly so, but with a sense that his life already belonged to something greater. His first major wound came in 1794, when he lost the sight in his right eye during an assault on Corsican forts. He continued. Then, in 1797, he lost his right arm in the Battle of Santa Cruz de Tenerife. He continued still. Each time, he returned to command not weaker, but more defined. By the turn of the 19th century, Nelson had become Britain's most celebrated naval officer. Yet even then, he walked with a limp, hid his scars beneath epaulets, and wrote of pain that never truly left him. His victories were not the rewards of strength, but of vision. And nowhere was that vision clearer than in the Battle of the Nile. In 1798, the French fleet lay anchored in Abu Qir Bay, near Alexandria. Napoleon had just launched his Egyptian campaign, threatening British access to India and dominance in the Mediterranean. Nelson found them at anchor, their ships arrayed in a tight line, seemingly protected by shallow waters. But he saw a gap and ordered his ships to sail between the French line and the shore, attacking from both sides. The result was devastation. The French fleet was destroyed. Napoleon's army stranded. Europe watched in disbelief. A new kind of admiral had arrived, one who defied the conventions of naval warfare with elegance and instinct. Nelson was not without controversy. His personal life stirred rumors, especially his relationship with Lady Emma Hamilton. But among sailors, he remained unquestioned. His commands were clear, his loyalty to his men unshakable. He believed that leadership meant trust, and that trust, once given, must never be betrayed. Then came 1805. The war with Napoleon had reached a climax. France and Spain were preparing a combined fleet to challenge Britain's control of the seas. If successful, it could open the English Channel to invasion. Nelson, now a vice-admiral, was given command of the British fleet and sent to intercept them. Off Cape Trafalgar, the two navies met. Nelson arranged his ships not in the traditional line, but in two bold columns, aiming to break through the enemy's formation and engage at close range. He flew a signal before the battle that would echo through history. England expects that every man will do his duty. The battle unfolded just as he had envisioned. His ship, HMS Victory, led one of the columns directly into the heart of the Franco-Spanish fleet. Cannon fire tore through decks, masts shattered, smoke rolled over the water like a curtain. Nelson, ever the visible commander, wore his full uniform, medals gleaming, despite warnings to dress inconspicuously. He believed a leader should be seen, even in danger. And then, from a sniper's perch aboard the French ship Redoutable, came the shot. It struck beneath his left shoulder, tearing through lung and spine. He was carried below deck, conscious but fading. He asked repeatedly how the battle fared. He was told the truth, that the enemy fleet was broken, Victory was assured. With that, he closed his eyes. "I am satisfied," he whispered. "Thank God I have done my duty." He died at 47. But his legacy had only begun. Trafalgar had not merely been a victory. It had ended Napoleon's dream of naval supremacy. It had secured Britain's maritime dominance for over a century. And Nelson had paid for it with the one thing he could not offer twice: his life. His body was returned to England in a cask of brandy to preserve it. His funeral drew thousands. He was buried in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral, beneath the dome where whispers still rise to meet stone. To this day, ships pass the white cliffs of Dover with his name in their logs. Young sailors study his tactics, veterans speak his words. His statue stands in Trafalgar Square, watching over a city that remembers. But it is not only his triumph that endures. It is his trust, his humility, his willingness to be broken in service of something larger. Horatio Nelson remains not just a figure of command, but of devotion. Now, as your thoughts drift gently toward rest, picture the deck of victory, the thud of boots, the flutter of canvas, the distant crash of waves on wood. And in the golden haze of dusk, a small man in full uniform stands still, eyes on the enemy and beyond. He does not flinch. He does not falter, because duty has already carried him this far, and further still. Let him stand watch for you tonight. Let his courage settle softly around your dreams, for there are some who do not seek peace in life, so that others may find it after. There are kings remembered for their crowns, and there are kings remembered for their swords. But now and then one is remembered for the wind in his sails, for his willingness to cross oceans in search of destiny, not by birthright, but by fire and water. Richard the Lionheart, a crusader by heart, a sailor by necessity, and a commander who carried his kingdom not on his back, but through the waves. Born in 1157 in Oxford, Richard Plantagenet was never meant to rule alone. He was the third son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, a royal house defined by ambition and flame. As a boy, Richard was steeped in poetry and war in equal measure. He spoke the tongue of knights before he ever addressed a court. And though England was his crown, it was Aquitaine, his mother's southern duchy, that stirred his blood. His fame would come not through politics but through steel, not by parchment but by lance, and soon not by land alone but at sea. When the Muslim leader Saladin recaptured Jerusalem in 187, the Christian world recoiled. A call to arms echoed from Rome to the Rhine. It would become the Third Crusade, the most ambitious yet, and Richard, bold and impatient, answered the call as few others could. He was crowned King of England in 1189, and scarcely a year later he set off not to settle into courtly routine, but to lead his people on a journey of thousands of miles across mountains, kingdoms, and seas. To do so, he needed more than armies. He needed a fleet. Richard turned his mind to the Channel, to the Mediterranean, to every harbor and coastline that might carry him to war. He began constructing ships, hiring mariners, and organizing what would become one of the most sophisticated naval operations of the age. Unlike many monarchs, he studied the sea, not as a noble pastime, but as a weapon. He understood currents. He calculated supply lines. He anticipated weather. In 1190, he sailed from Messina, Sicily, with a massive fleet of galleys and transports. It was not a peaceful voyage. Storms scattered his ships. Pirates circled. Rivals and allies alike tested his temper. But Richard, bold, impulsive, yet brilliant, never wavered. He regrouped in Cyprus, where he clashed with the island's ruler, Isaac Komnenos. In mere weeks, Richard captured the entire island, not for glory, but to use it as a naval stronghold, a staging ground for his crusade. Cyprus became a crucial base for the Crusaders, and Richard used it to launch his most famous campaign, the Siege of Acre. There, his command of both land and sea made the difference. His ships brought weapons, fresh troops, and siege engines. He coordinated blockades. He negotiated with Genoese and Pisan fleets. He understood that control of the coast was the key to holding the land. The siege lasted months, brutal and unrelenting. Disease ravaged both sides, but Richard's leadership was constant. He moved between trench and deck, issuing orders, soothing tempers, demanding resolve. And when Acre finally fell, it was clear that this was no ordinary king. He was more than armored flesh. He was a strategist with salt on his lips. In the months that followed, he continued south, battling Saladin's forces along the coast of what is now Israel. The two leaders, vastly different in faith and culture, developed a kind of mutual respect, wary yet profound. Richard never took Jerusalem. He saw the terrain, the supply issues, the religious divisions, and chose restraint. It frustrated many. But even in denial, his leadership left a mark. After 3 years away, Richard began the journey home. It would be the sea again that changed everything. Sailing through the Adriatic, a storm scattered his convoy. Seeking safety, he traveled by land in disguise, hoping to pass unnoticed through hostile territories. But he was recognized, captured, and imprisoned by Leopold V of Austria, a former ally turned rival. A king held hostage. Back in England, his brother schemed. His kingdom trembled. But Richard's absence only strengthened the myth. Songs were written, gold was gathered. Eventually, a massive ransom was paid, more than any kingdom had ever given. He returned not as a conquering king, but as a tested one. He would never see Jerusalem again. He would never take another crusade. But the ocean would not forget him. Nor would those who had seen a king command both ship and shore. He died in 1199, not in battle at sea, but from a crossbow wound in France. It was a quiet end to a life that had thundered with motion. Yet the echoes remained. In time, he became legend, not just for his courage, but for his understanding that power needed movement, that kingdoms were not merely fields and cities, but coasts and currents. Richard the Lionheart was no sailor by birth, but the sea knew him, and it carried his ambition like wind through canvas. Today, when history remembers naval commanders, it sometimes overlooks those who led fleets not by profession, but by necessity. Richard was among the first of Europe's rulers to treat naval strength as equal to cavalry, to view ports not just as edges, but as gateways. His legacy is not a line of ships, but the decision to sail, to cross, to command, to trust the wind and meet destiny across the blue. Now as night settles softly around you, let your thoughts drift back to a Mediterranean shoreline, torches flickering along a quiet dock, the creak of wooden hulls resting in moonlight, and standing near the helm, armored and watchful, a king surveys the stars. Not for conquest tonight, but for the path home. Richard the Lionheart, the king who became a sailor, and taught the world that even crowns may kneel before the sea. Let his quiet command guide your rest. For some rulers ride. When the tides of the Indian Ocean turn beneath a silver moon, and the scent of spice drifts along forgotten harbors, a name returns with the wind, not with conquest, but with grace. A name born on waves that once carried fleets of impossible size and harmony. Zheng He, the admiral who did not sail to conquer, but to connect. His story begins not with rank, but with rupture. He was born in 1371, in the Yunnan province of China, during the waning years of the Yuan dynasty. His name at birth was Ma He. His family were Muslims, descendants of Persian and Central Asian traders, and his father was said to have made the pilgrimage to Mecca. But Ma He's childhood was upended when Ming forces captured his city during their consolidation of power. He was taken as a boy, castrated and conscripted into service. A brutal beginning, a path not chosen, yet one that would lead him to heights no boy could have dreamed. He was placed in the household of the future Yongle emperor, who came to trust him deeply. He proved himself not only loyal, but capable, sharp in intellect, graceful in diplomacy, and fearless in battle. When the prince seized the throne, he rewarded the young eunuch with a new name, Zheng He. With that name came a destiny. The Ming Empire, newly stable, sought to restore its image, not as a recluse, but as the center of a civilized world. They wanted the world to see China's strength, not through conquest, but through presence. Zheng He would be the messenger. In 1405, he was appointed commander of what would become one of the largest fleets the world had ever seen. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of sailors, soldiers, interpreters, scholars, and traders. These were not warships alone. They carried silk, porcelain, lacquerware, and letters from the emperor himself. The aim was not invasion. It was invitation. From the very first voyage, it was clear this was no ordinary expedition. They sailed through the South China Sea, past the Malacca Strait, across the Bay of Bengal, and into the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as Calicut on the western coast of India. They visited ancient ports, revived forgotten alliances, and opened new routes for exchange. Zheng He did not demand tribute by force. Instead, he offered gifts, and with them, the assurance of goodwill. But make no mistake, his fleet was formidable. Pirates fled at its approach. Rogue kingdoms reconsidered their ambitions. In Sri Lanka, when a local ruler defied the mission, Zheng He responded with swift precision, defeating his forces, capturing the leader, and returning him to China in chains, not as a trophy, but as a warning. Over the next 3 decades, Zheng He led 7 major voyages, each spanning thousands of miles and dozens of cultures. His ships reached the Arabian Peninsula, the Horn of Africa, even the coastlines near modern-day Kenya. In one port, a giraffe was offered as tribute, so strange and elegant that the Chinese court believed it to be a mythical qilin. But more than wonders, Zheng He brought maps, knowledge, understanding. He created detailed records of coastlines, climates, people, and trade. He built trust among foreign rulers. He enabled the movement of goods, ideas, and cultures with a peaceful hand. In an age when many empires expanded by blade, he expanded China's influence by sail. And yet, his memory nearly disappeared. After the Yongle Emperor's death, China's priorities shifted. Later emperors viewed the voyages as wasteful, even dangerous. They dismantled the fleet, halted maritime exploration, and allowed the great shipyards to rot. Zheng He's records were sealed or destroyed, his achievements silenced. For centuries, his story lay dormant beneath layers of official history. But the sea, always patient, holds its echoes. In coastal towns across Asia and East Africa, oral traditions remembered the tall Chinese admiral with kindness and clarity. Mosques, temples, and shrines bear his name. Local legends tell of the fleet's visits, not as invasions, but as moments of awe and exchange. Today, historians continue to uncover his legacy. The scale of his expeditions remains unmatched for their time. His largest treasure ships were said to be over 400 feet long, towering above the caravels of Europe, which would not sail widely for another half-century. And more than size, it was the intent that distinguished him. Zheng He did not colonize. He did not enslave. He sailed with confidence, but not cruelty. His mission was never to dominate, but to engage. As a Muslim, he prayed in foreign mosques. As a Chinese subject, he honored the emperor's authority. As a sailor, he charted the stars, read the winds, and carried the promise of harmony wherever the waves led. He died around 1433, either at sea or shortly after his final voyage. No grave remains, only stories. Perhaps that is fitting, for the ocean was always his home, and the currents remember. Today, statues of Zheng He stand in cities from Nanjing to Malacca. Maritime academies study his roots. His name re-emerges in diplomacy, in scholarship, in song. But it is not only ships and maps he left behind. It is an idea. That power can move not through force, but through presence. That respect may be carried farther than conquest. That an empire, secure in itself, can reach outward with an open hand. Now, as you settle into the quiet rhythm of night, imagine the decks of a Ming treasure ship beneath a starry sky. The creak of sails, the hush of water parting gently, lanterns swinging softly in the breeze, and standing at the helm, robed and resolute, a man looks out not with hunger, but with welcome. Zheng, the admiral who reached the world, not to take, but to offer. Let his journey sail alongside your dreams tonight, calm, steady, boundless.